What's hello in Russian?
Oh, well, I don't even know how to say no. Like, I know da is yes.
Well, either way, class today, we are headed to the Russian Empire. Uh, this episode that Chris and I were going to do, he's Chris, I'm Adam.
What's up?
Our plan starting out with was to do an entire episode on the whole of the Russian Empire.
It was the Tsars. So
Tsarist Russia.
It's like, hey, yeah, let's do Tsarist Russia. And then it was more like, hey, like a day into research, it was like, hey, so should we just do the Romanov Dynasty? There's two main dynasties as far as Tsarist Russia goes. I can't even remember the first one. Do you remember what it was?
It was what Ivan the Terrible was.
Yes. And then you had the Romanov Dynasty, and we were like, well, let's just cover that. So, of course, the Romanov Dynasty starts with the topic of our class today. A lot of great Peters in the world, but there was only one Peter the Great. And this guy's who essentially kind of brought the Romanov Dynasty into prominence. And as soon as we started researching him, we're like, shit, we're already like, in our minds when we're doing research, we can already kind of tell how many hours in we're going to be based on what we're studying. And we were already 2 hours in. And I was like, shit, there's more Peter to cover.
Yeah, that was something that we ran into where regardless of how far we went past Peter just kept drawing our eyes. It's a situation where Peter was never on my radar. I don't think he was ever on your radar either, as far as like knowing who he was.
Weirdly enough, if you would have told me like what sounds more familiar, Catherine the Great or Peter the Great, Catherine the Great.
For sure. And as it, I think, should be. But Peter's a lot of fun. Peter's a dirtbag. Peter's a bad guy, but I think we both kind of fell for Peter because he is just a crazy off the wall. You kind of put it perfectly when we were talking about this. He's like if brilliance and insanity had a child.
He's the epitome of work hard, play hard.
Oh, yeah.
But, I mean, it's weird to see because this is the transition from when people talk about, you can talk about certain countries and you get an image of your head of what the traditional, look of that country would be. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you view it in specific eras. If someone talks about Rome or someone talks about Italy, you probably see like either vineyards or like Rome. Someone talks about Greece, you're automatically going to be thinking, the white cliffs and the white shores and, Athens, all that kind of stuff. When you talk about Russia, you kind of just view it, or at least I do, I guess, as like the Cold War era-esque gray kind of, just very blah, just very bland. And with Peter, you get to see how Russia changed from almost like, man, you would almost call it more like Ottoman Mongolian type style.
Knuckle draggers.
Yeah. To essentially almost what would be a mirror image of what we see as most like European medieval societies.
But the reason that he did that was because he was the first czar in 100 years to leave Russia, to go on what's called an embassy. And it's an incredible story, but that just shows you how far Russia was just isolated themselves from everybody else, that their leader never went out and met anybody else. They didn't do what all of the other empires were doing at that point, where they were marrying off children to other rulers or
everything
other
was
princes.
In-house.
Yeah.
And because of that, and because of that isolation and lack of kind of sharing resources or at least information, when Peter got into power, he's just like, fuck, like we're so far behind. I'm going to go ahead and have to speed this thing up a bit.
We don't even have a navy.
Yeah, exactly.
The most basic things. And granted, Russia's pretty landlocked and they're frozen for most of the year.
Except for up north. But again, that's areas that freeze that you don't have access to.
Yeah. And not to say that the Ottomans were knuckle draggers, but they were kind of like the cavemen of Russia, or of the Eurasian continent.
Yeah.
Like they were the furthest behind everybody else, and Peter was basically, he threw the rope over his shoulder and he dragged Russia into this new era because the Enlightenment never made it to Russia.
No.
This is something
he kind of had to do his own Enlightenment. He kind of had to start that.
He was Enlightenment for dummies.
Yeah, exactly. All right, well, we're already kind of getting deep into it and everything, but we need to go back to the beginning. But before we do that, remember, guys, wherever you listen to your podcast, rate us as high as you'd like or as high as you possibly can. And keep sending in the comments and the feedback. We love getting that. You got anything else?
No, let's jump in.
All right, let's get into Peter the Great. Okay, well, of course, before we get to Peter, we kind of have to set the stage for what Peter's coming into.
Yeah, Russia was a place that it seemed like Mongol influence was a pretty big deal. They had come over, they had different standings in the courts of Russia. Russia was known as, we just talked about this, the Moscavia? Muscavia?
The way you're throwing me off. Muscovy.
Muscovy, that's right. Before it was Russia, I'm sure that's where the name Moscow comes from, is the Muscovy people. From the 10th to the 17th centuries, the Russians were ruled by what's known as the boyar class of basically the noblemen who had a czar, Tsar. I think it gets changed to Czar after Caesar.
Well, no. So what they say is the way that it's spelled mostly. The whole thing with czar is it's off Caesar, regardless of how they spell it.
Oh, okay.
Essentially, the Russian spelling of it would be Tsar. The one that we see is Czar in English.
Okay. And he was the absolute monarch. He was the ruler, but you also had this boyar class underneath of the noblemen. I want to say at one point in time, and this might have been before or after him, the peasant class made up like 90% of the population.
I think that's kind of just a commonality.
That 90% feels like a lot. Like you're either a nobleman or you're a peasant. But there's like working class, I think, everywhere else.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, like you said, I don't think there is that much of a middle class. I don't think you've got it made or you're working for the people that have it made. And then maybe a smattering of those people that are just kind of in the middle. But I think it has to be it's like today, man. All the money at the very top.
Yeah.
And then just everybody done. And then the differentiation between that makes everybody else like a peasant class.
And it also could be that the noblemen were kind of the merchant class because they were the ones that
had the money to start the business. Yeah.
Ivan III from 1462 to 1505 would establish kind of the centralized Russian state. They would also secure independence from the Tartars, which was a Turkic ethnic group that was in the area. His grandson, Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, they have a weird way of... he gained that name, obviously, after he had died. The Terrible is not a big enough word to describe how bad Ivan IV was. This guy was very, very bad, and he'll get his own episode. We're talking... It felt like, to me, learning a little bit about him, he's like a Genghis Khan level... bad dude.
Yeah.
He would be the first monarch that would be crowned the Tsar of Russia. There was vast expansion.
So the Tsar of all Russia.
Yeah.
Right.
Tsar of all Russia, yeah. There's weird titles that there's Tsar of all Russia, and then there's what Peter gets, Tsar of all the Russias.
Yeah, something like, yeah.
And this is partially due to them expanding down into present-day Ukraine. More of the northern half of Ukraine, but still kind of had a hold in the south. So he just expanded this empire that kept building and building. Once they gained their independence from Ivan III, Ivan IV was like, all right, let's spread our wings. Let's see what we got around here. And he would be the last in what Chris was talking about earlier, the Rurikic Dynasty, Rurik Dynasty, Rurikic, I think. Alexius would be he wasn't the first Romanov dynasty, but his father was, so he was kind of like where they gained their footing, because obviously the first guy doesn't create a dynasty in himself. It's passing it down to your child that starts the dynastic line.
Yeah, and the way that the naming works out and everything, they have their names, but then they also have their royal title as Romanov. But I wonder too, like we talk about like the British royal family, Windsor, but is Windsor still really their last name? I mean, like
Kate Windsor, Elizabeth Windsor. Yeah, I've never actually heard their last names be said. Besides Princess Di, maybe?
So essentially, Alexei, his name is, and we're talking about Peter's dad, right?
Yes,
So,
Alexius.
Yeah, Alexei Mikhailovich is his name. And this guy liked to get busy with his first wife, 13 kids. The youngest of those kids with the first wife was actually Ivan V. So, like most royal families do, you got to keep lining up the same name. Has that name recognition. And then ends up having 3 children with his second wife. And the youngest of those children was Peter? One of those children was Peter.
Yeah, and this is where a lot of this really comes to a head, was Alexius having 2 wives when it came time for succession. The original family, Miloslav...
Mikhailovich?
No. His wife's side, the Miloslavskaya side. Miloslavskaya. Miloslavskaya. Hey, you guys that love these bad pronunciations are just going to eat this episode up. That was the maternal line that his first wife bore the children from. Mm-hmm. And then the second line that Peter was from was the Narishkina side, the Narishkina family. As Alexius gets older, you have to start looking at where this line of succession is going to go. Peter, being the son of Natalia, that was his mother.
And he's born June 9th, 1672. So that's when Peter's born.
Crazy to think that in the span of kind of when he was born all the way up until 1918 was just the Romanov family.
Yeah.
Like, that's a very long time, it feels like, to be in power. But as Alexius was getting older, they were trying to figure some things out. Fyodor III was basically, I think he was the eldest son of Alexius from his first marriage.
Yeah. And they only, like, again, this is at a time when mortality, especially in Russia, wasn't great. And so they'll talk about how many kids they have, but then also how many kids survive into adulthood. And you have like 13 kids, and then you're like, but only 5 survived into adulthood.
5's a good number. It's more like 2 or 3.
Well, and here's the thing, though, too, is making it to adulthood doesn't mean that these people are healthy, because that comes in to be kind of a reoccurring problem. Because Alexius in 1676, he ends up dying, and Fyodor III ends up taking his place. So you have him in, he gets in 1676. He essentially is not healthy.
No.
And that's what happens also when, I don't know how much, I'm not, is this a situation where it's kind of like with all of these boyar class families, things like that? Is this kind of a situation where over long periods of time, this has a Habsburgs type thing to it, where essentially people are all kind of
inbreeding?
Yeah, to a certain extent. And then after a certain period of time, you have so many of those people sharing some type of genetic, lineage that it's going to cause some issues.
Yeah, I could absolutely see that, because they were so isolated for so long that eventually you're going to,
and there's only so many people in the that upper class. So Fyodor ends up dying in 1682, and one of the things that, if you don't have children, there's no one else. If he would have had a child, that essentially would have been the next person in line. But because he dies childless, now it goes into this murky line of succession where, is it going to be essentially the next in line from the Miloslavskaya line, or is it going to be from the Narishkina? So essentially, is it going to be again from his first wife's line or from his second wife's line, where Peter's actually? So they end up coming to essentially a compromise, because Peter has the support of what's called the Strelsky, and also some of these powerful like Boyar families.
Mm-hmm.
And they want to see Peter actually on the throne. Now, I don't know if this is like, hey, this first wife, you had your shot. You had Feodor in there. Now it's time to let the other family have a shot. But what ends up happening is you get this situation where you have essentially co-czars. And so Peter co-czars with Ivan V, who was the youngest son with the first wife.
He was also partially blind. He was pretty
Described as weak-minded.
lame.
And was pretty much just there as kind of just a stand-in or a body. So the first wife, that side of the family, still had some semblance of power, because if something happened to where there was any type of dispute or something happened to Peter, then they would still be in that seat where they could kind of then be the lone, the lone lineage or the lone line there.
Well, and so much of the issue that's going on is Ivan is from the first queen's lineage, and she just died. Like, it wasn't like there was a divorce. It wasn't like there was a separation. She died the queen. And so I'm sure the family felt like, well, our line needs to be in there. Like, it has to be Ivan because he was the daughter or the son of the first queen.
Well, I mean, and what they end up doing is, so, she dies, but she also had a daughter. And
Sophia.
The daughter, Sophia. So Sophia is Ivan V's sister. And what ends up happening is, because this is at a time like 1682, he's 10 years old. Peter is only 10 years old at this point. This is at a time, again, when even we talked about it kind of during the British monarchy episode, where they were putting up kids that were like 3 years old, and they're like, no, we're all rallying around this fucking toddler, and he's going to be our ruler, just trying to get into power.
You just need a board of regents to be able to guide him.
So, and because Ivan V was the youngest at that point, they were closer in age. So you basically have Sophia running the show. So much so, in fact, that they had a dual throne that was made, to where Peter and Ivan V were both sitting on it. There was the hole in the back cut out of it.
It was Natalia was the original regent. Peter's mom.
Okay.
And the whole issue that happens was, obviously you want an adult in there to be the regent.
You'd like that.
Yeah. So Sophia feels like her family has the claim because she's a descendant of the original queen. Sophia starts to spread a rumor throughout the Streltsy, which is the Imperial Guard, basically, is what they are.
It's really the only standing military they currently have at the time. So if something is going to happen, a coup is going to happen, it's not like you can just go and gather up the army. You got to get these guys on your side, because they are the ones that currently have the weapons and the force to go ahead and make this thing happen.
And she starts to accuse the Narishkinka family of poisoning Fyodor to try to get him out of power, to try to make Peter the Tsar. And as she's spreading these rumors, the Streltsy realize that they aren't going to be able to do as much as they want having an adult in Natalia as the regent. So they start to run with this idea that there was a poisoning that happens. And basically the Streltsy revolt to try to throw Peter's family, the Narishkina family, out of power, because Natalia is the regent. So she's the one that rules over them, but she's not the first queen. She's the second queen. Mm-hmm. And in this process, through this political violence that happens, his uncle, Artemon Artemon is dragged down the stairs of the royal palace. He is killed in front of Peter and his mother, and then he is tossed over the railing, dismembered, and the Streltsy were just taking pieces of him around town and just showing off what they had done. Mm-hmm. And 10-year-old Peter sees this, and he ends up, like, throughout his life, he develops tics. He is epileptic. He goes into these fits, and it's believed that it was because of all the trauma that he saw that like during the days. It wasn't even just one day of them killing and trying to expel the family. It was days.
And essentially they can't. They're trying to take the family out of a position of power, but they can't go so far as to kill Peter, who is essentially at this point in line to be co-king.
Yeah, the Tsar. So after this happens, the Streltsy, like I said, murder and dismember his uncle, who was also his godfather.
Oh, yes. So that was the Streltsy Rebellion. That was April and May. It was 2 months.
Yeah.
In 1682. So essentially the same year that Fyodor dies.
After this happens, the rebellion would lead to Ivan being the senior ruler of the two of them, with Sophia as the regent. So the older sister is the regent. Peter and his mother were banished from the whole entire royal district of Moscow at that point, and they were at like a summer estate outside of the zone that they weren't allowed to be in anymore.
They were basically prisoners of this estate.
Yeah, but at the same time, they wanted to push them as far away from the seat of power as possible, but then just kind of let them live lives. And this is where Peter starts to develop this fascination with sailing. He would have kind of like teachers almost. I'm struggling to find the word. Not really teachers, but
mentors?
Yes, mentors is a good term. That would kind of be in charge of teaching him the things that he wanted to know.
Like tutors.
Tutors almost, yes. Trying to educate him in things. But also at the same time, they would be fostering his creativity. So one day they're walking around this estate, and it's him and a Dutchman that he had met, I think, when they weren't into what's known as the German district, and it's just basically where all of the immigrants come.
Yeah, it was very segregated as far as like if you were, Russian or anything like that, you could live in these areas. Then there was areas in which people, just like they did when people were coming over here to the States, you would gather essentially in communities of people like you because it was just more comfortable. But Peter kind of being afforded, he was basically kind of taken out of the position of ruling because, kind of like I was saying before, and I can't believe I skipped over the rebellion, Sophia had essentially a hole cut behind the throne. So when Peter had to be there essentially for appearances to... Go ahead.
That was Natalia that had the hole cut there. Sophia was basically, when she came in as the regent, she told Peter, "You're to be seen and not heard." And Ivan didn't really care to be there at all. So she was the one that was doing the talking whenever it was going on. Sophia was the second regent, and Natalia was the first regent that ended up being kicked out when they made Ivan the senior ruler.
But if she got kicked out in 1682, what time was there when Natalia would have had been like telling them both to rule?
The first couple months.
Oh, okay.
Because Sophia comes up pretty quickly once she realizes that she's not going to be the regent, with the belief that Natalia's family was the one that poisoned Fyodor to kill him to get Peter into power.
Okay.
But him and this Dutch friend are walking along, and they come upon this building on the property that they said hadn't been opened in like 20 years. They end up opening up the building, and somehow, for some reason, it's never explained. I don't get it. I'll never understand it. There is an old, decrepit English ship sitting inside of this, basically like cabin on their estate. And Peter looks at it, starts talking to the Dutch guy. He's like, "Do you think we could fix this?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, we can fix this. We can put this together." And this was like Peter's first time of being able to look at an actual sailing vessel that was a sailing vessel proper. Because like we say with Russia, they have a lot of water ports that are coming off of rivers and that type of thing. Mm-hmm. But those are more like frigates. They're like little boats that
barges.
Barges, yes. Yeah. Flat bottoms. What's a frigate? Is a frigate not a barge?
Frigate, I think, usually is like a smaller warship.
Okay, it's just a fun name to say. But these flat bottom barges that would go down rivers, and this is actually a proper English sailing ship. Like, this is a ship that isn't just solely dependent on the wind to take it in which direction it needs to go.
Wait, it's not solely dependent?
No, because it had oars too.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Whereas the barges, you throw your sail up, it takes you down river. You have to wait until you can get enough wind to go back the other direction. And Peter just kind of falls in love with sailing. His fascination with sailing would take him to the German quarter that we were talking about before of Moscow, where he would befriend two guys, Andrew Vinicius, who taught him Dutch. So actually taught him the language, and he introduced him to two other Dutch carpenters that taught him all of these different boat building skills, to the point to where he went back to the estate and was like building his own harbor on the water because he just wanted to be around boats. He loved building boats.
And at this point too, he's like probably around 16 years old.
Pretty close. Yeah.
I don't know. He went through an event where he saw like a bunch of people in his family basically get killed in front of him. He knows this is something that kind of could happen again, because the people that are in control, that are in more control than he is, are the people that actually kind of led that to begin with. And so at this point in his life, I don't think it's really entering. He's either really good at hiding this, or he's not thinking about it at this point of coming back and actually taking the czarship, or essentially taking the throne. So he's using this time to basically just kind of be like, I'm just going to try to figure out some shit that I like doing.
Well, I'm sure, too, at the same time, he's looking for a distraction to take him as far away mentally from what he had just seen as a child.
That, too, and I think if he is... Because, of course, he's going to have people watching him.
Yeah.
If he's sitting somewhere, or he's trying to, like, talk to people and everything, they're going to be like, well, he's trying to, he's still communicating with people, that kind of shit. If the people reporting back to, Ivan and Sophia, and they're just like, no, he's just fucking... sailing. He's building a fucking dock.
Yeah.
And he's actually been hanging out in the German district, and they just talk about shit. It's like, that's all he's doing. So he's not like trying to come and take power. They're like pretty much the farthest thing from it you can.
Yeah. His interests at this time were drawing more towards math, geometry, military sciences. And I'm sure a big part of this is math and geometry. You're looking at the stars. You're trying to figure out sailing routes, things like that, as you're looking at maps.
He ends up receiving a sextant, I think.
Yeah, I don't know what that was.
Okay, so sextant is the way that I understand it. It's like it's a metal tool. And basically you find, and it's got a scope where you find and you line it up with, I think, either the horizon or two fixed points.
Oh, okay.
And it can tell you, I think, how fast you're traveling.
Oh, that would make sense. But those things over the arts, like he wasn't really into painting. He wasn't into any sort of, like, I wouldn't say philosophical, but he wanted to work more with his hands than
I feel like
he's
more into the practicality, the practical
Yes,
sciences.
it's a good way to put it.
If you're going to say that.
And part of this was he loved conducting mock wars with his little toy army that he had been given. He would, set up scenarios, and he would try to outflank himself and to figure out this military strategy.
Basically playing a risk.
Pretty much. Yeah.
So he ends up, when Sophia takes power, she's in charge basically of any like decisions that the government's going to do or the army's going to have for conflicts. And she gets started early because in 1682 to 1689, basically a 7-year period, she does a couple campaigns into Crimea, and things don't turn out so well. They end up losing, I think, both of these campaigns. And kind of looking at that, if you're not, essentially, if you're losing, people are going to be, grumbling and maybe looking for a change of leadership, especially if there's a known other person that's already kind of in that position. They're going to be asking, well, who was making these decisions? Like, maybe we should let Peter start making the decisions.
Yeah, it's not going well. And not to mention, Russia has a very interesting history in this empire, because female rulers, while Sophia is kind of technically the first, I mean, she's a regent, but she's the first female that has superpowers.
The other czar is weak-minded and blind.
Yeah, it's true.
It doesn't get more compliant than that.
But there are a lot of queens in the Romanov Dynasty, which is, to me, pretty surprising compared to like the monarchy that we had done before, or the Scottish sort of monarchy that we went to in that episode. But Sophia starts to sense that Peter has a desire to take over because he's finally of age. He's not 10 years old anymore. He's not an adult yet, but in Russian terms, he's an adult man in his teens.
So listen, he's kind of moved on from the boat thing. He's starting to look into other stuff. Well, what's he doing? Fuck, we just see him out with his tiny toy soldiers just making maneuvers and stuff like that. And I'm not going to lie to you, he's getting pretty fucking good.
Yeah, he's moving those pieces pretty well. So Sophia goes to the Streltsy and she's like, hey, I need your guys' support. I know that Peter's still around, but just understand, if you're loyal to me, I will make sure that your families get kind of first pick out of anything that they need. And again, Streltsy are partially made, the foot soldiers are going to be peasants. They're going to be the poor, but the leaders, the generals within this group are all going to be coming from the upper class.
Well, and they know that the current kind of, I guess you could say, regime at this point was the one that they put in there. So it's the one that they're going to get the most out of.
Yeah. And the one that they can manipulate the most,
Yes.
because they were the ones that did the rebellion for the first family. Peter kind of creates himself almost two, not necessarily standing armies, but just through growing up, he's given these friends of these elites. He attracts peasant children, children of immigrants, and he ends up forming kind of like this little child army where it had full-blown a ranking system. You start out at drummer boy, you get moved all the way up to general, and he actually joins his own little army as a drummer boy. And out of all of his friends and everything, he brings in older kind of military leaders to teach them strategy and to drill them, to make them sort of like this little child fighting force. And he believes in merit-based, what's it called?
Meritocracy.
A meritocracy, but when you...
Promotion?
Yes, merit-based promotions. So even though he is still technically the czar of the country, he is starting himself at the lowest end. And part of the reason was he said that the position of drummer boy was more fun than the general making the actual decisions.
Yeah, it's low stakes, man.
But
you go off beat, you can just find it again.
when it comes down to promotion, though, he's the one that's making these choices. So his friends that are from the lower class are getting promoted just based upon how good they are in this little game of soldier that they're playing. And some of the kids that are coming from these upper echelon families, like, how come this is happening? You know, why are these kids getting these promotions before we are? Do you not know who our families are? And at the same time, he's also giving promotions to people that are jumping over him as the Tsar of Russia. So there's really not a lot that they can say. But what were the two groups?
It was the Preobrazhensky and the Semyonovsky.
Were these two kind of elite forces that he had, and they had family members that were in the Imperial Army, and they kind of got wind that there was a chance that Peter was going to be targeted by them for assassination. Yeah. And part of the reason they thought this was Peter had sent off a letter back to what's essentially the Kremlin back then. And his messenger ends up getting picked off by the Streltsy and is killed. So they're trying to figure out what that is, what's going on. He ends up getting moved further away for his own protection. The Streltsy never end up coming for him, but kind of through this system of these two elite forces that he had created, he starts to speak to the Streltsy. He's like, hey, I want to do this.
So kind of the way I'm understanding it, I'm fixating too much on like building up these forces too much. So from what I kind of got in my research, when you had someone that was like a czar or even someone in the royal family, you actually surrounded them kind of with the kids of like other boyar families, things like that, to essentially give them friends, but also give them kind of a group of people that they can actually grow up with, that then they can assign to different positions that they know their strengths, they know their weaknesses. Basically, you're growing them up with an entourage. But because these kids that are growing up are also from these prominent families probably have kind of to a degree their own little armies or securities to patrol their lands. So there's places that they can draw people to fight from. They have a bunch of peasants in the peasant classes that are working their lands. So it's not like Peter is just like, he's just having these kids form these little tactical groups. He's actually able to raise a pretty substantial force just because of the loyalty he has from his little entourage and then their families and whatnot. After the attempts on his life, or kind of the thoughts of the talk about the attempts on his life, he basically gains enough support to basically overthrow Sophia. And that was in the summer. So, I mean, from the time that she's in power from 1682, summer of 1689, basically that's when he kind of enacts his plans to wrest control of the Russian Empire from her.
Sophia gets thrown.
I mean, Ivan's not going to see it coming.
No, no, certainly not. There's one side of Ivan that he can sneak up on that Ivan would have no idea there's another person there. He overthrows Sophia, and instead of killing her, since he's her half brother, he just goes ahead and throws her in a nunnery in a convent. It was very close to town, and the reason that I say that, she was given kind of like a suite, so it wasn't like she was locked up in a room. She just couldn't leave the convent. That plays a part coming up soon, that this was within the city.
When they send someone to a convent like that, does that then force them to be a nun, or is it just, I'm sending you here because, like, I don't want you to be able to have sex? Is it a dual punishment? Like, I'm going to make you... Because a nun, you have to kind of renounce all of those possessions. And
you have to take your vows.
And take your vows. So in this weird way, it's not only a prison from a standpoint of a physical place where you have to stay. You're also like psychologically mind-fucking this person by being like, all of this shit that you become accustomed to, all of these perks that you get from ruling, it's all fucking gone. You're going to have to study the fucking Bible all the time. You're never going to have sex with anyone else again. And you're going to have to do this day in and day out till you die.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty bad punishment. After Sophia is thrown in the convent, Peter and Ivan are again announced as the co-rulers, but this time the regent is back to Natalia. Natalia was pretty vigilant over her son Peter, and she felt at the age of 16 it was time to get Peter married. This is something pretty fun that I found out that they did back then. They were called bride shows. And think of it as sort of like the Bachelor that we have in the States, where it's one man who gets all of these women lined up in front of him. But the tricky part about the bride show is the women that are presented to be the brides for Peter or for whoever the Tsar is don't come from the highest families in the elites, in the Streltsy and anything like that, or in the boyar class. They end up coming from lower level families, so that way once they get married into royalty and she becomes the Tsarina or whatever they want to call them, they don't have the political clout or power to try to basically perform a coup and take over. So we want you to be married to somebody noble, but we don't want you to be married into a noble enough family to challenge us for the crown.
Yeah.
The woman that Natalia kind of chooses and handpicks, and again, this whole bridal party thing that they do is Peter's supposed to go around and pick who he wants to have. He gets steered by Natalia to a woman named Eudoxia Lopincunia. She was the one that was requested by her mother, or by his mother, and she was kind of the antithesis of Peter. She was raised in a way to where she was subservient. She didn't like that he was kind of a ruffian, and when I say kind of a ruffian, you'll understand very quickly just how crazy this dude was. And they didn't really love each other, which I don't know if love was an actual thing back then that they had. It was more like we could stand each other.
This exact thing is going to come into play with something that he actually does and list his reasoning for it. And it makes me come back to this and being like, he has maybe some firsthand experience. You got, it'll make sense here in a little bit.
And this happens at the age of 16. So that would have been 16. 80,
88.
88?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. By 1692, he had taken up with a mistress named Anna Mons, and he had befriended her brother Willem. These two are very important. Willem will come to a very unceremonious end through maybe some scuttlebutt that happens later on. But as Tsar, he made these frequent trips into the German quarter where these immigrants were, and he would spend a lot of time with them because he knew that he didn't have a lot in common with the Russian elites. The Boyar weren't really his people. He didn't like them very much because they sort of helped him be taken out of power the first time during this rebellion.
You're going to have some mistrust of being like, if I misstep, if I don't do what they want, are they just going to turn around and just, she's still in the convent. I didn't kill her.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
There's always a chance that
Ivan V is still alive.
all issues are going to flare up, yeah. So as he's spending time down in this area, he ends up starting to make these friends, and he starts to expand his circle. I believe that's where he meets Anna Mons and Willem. But at the same time, he's gaining more of this idea of what goes on outside of Russia. He's starting to see kind of what Western culture in Europe has to offer, and he starts thinking about it as like, well, we're really behind. Like these people are telling me all of these stories that are coming out of England, out of France, out of
what is a newspaper?
The Netherlands. Yeah. What are you guys talking about? He would end up becoming independent sovereign at 22 upon the death of his mother in 1694. That had a pretty big effect on him to kind of lose the woman that had spent all of this time with him and been through thick and thin with him through these rebellions and tried to raise him and tried to kind of keep an eye on him.
So independent rulers in the fact that he no longer kind of has his mother as like a regent type person.
Yeah, there's no regent anymore.
Yeah, so it's actually just still him and Ivan at this point, right?
Yeah, and then 2 years later, it's just him because Ivan ends up dying, making him sole ruler. And along those lines, Fierro, the first brother that was
Fyodor.
Fyodor. Mm-hmm. It only lived to the age of 21.
Just say Theodore like Mike Tyson would.
Fyodor like Mike. Okay. Fyodor only ended up living to 21. Ivan is going to die very young as well. So at 22, he is the sole czar of all of Russia. And all of these friends that Peter had made growing up, these lifelong friends, there's one of them, Nikita Zoltov, and another one, Michael Romanodonsky, we'll call him.
You got it.
They would play major support roles during Peter's reign because he knew that he could trust him. Just like Chris was talking about, these friends that he had made when he was younger, he knew that he could put in positions to trust them to be able to do what they needed to do. And a big part of this, I'm sure, was because they knew each other's secrets because these dudes partied hard. Their initial little group of friends, they would end up calling the Jolly Company.
I kind of see it like this. You're like, think of it in terms of even like the British royal family. You got Prince William, who is going to be the person that's speaking. Especially nowadays, there wasn't a lot of question at what point he was born. It's, with the survivability and everything like that. So you're Prince Harry. He got to be essentially Prince Harry. He got to like fucking party. He didn't have any of the responsibility. He knew he still had a role to play, but he didn't have any power. So he was just fucking living it up at that point. And now he finds himself in sole power, but he's got kind of the same group that he likes hanging out with. He's not, like you said earlier, he doesn't get along with that boyar class. So basically, when he gets into that position, he brings all these people with him, or at least kind of this mentality that he's kind of developed. And through, like you were saying, through just even speaking to these people, hearing things from Western Europe, and he starts to kind of build this ideology for how he's going to modernize Russia. And he felt that it was his duty to essentially bring Russia on par with all these other countries as a European power. Had some kind of negative, feelings regarding kind of his outlook on the Russian people. He saw them as rude, unintelligent, and felt that it was his duty to implement changes that would essentially pick these people up out of the mud and kind of elevate these people. It was kind of a situation where I'm doing this for you, this is going to hurt you a lot more than it hurts me, but I am actually doing this for you guys. He did have this outlook, though, where he felt like he had the duties of a monarch to actually care for his subjects, to actually protect them, and to actually work for their benefit. Working for their benefit was his vision of working for their benefit, but it's still, it's weird to think that there are other rulers and monarchs that really don't care about their people. It's just about enriching themselves and essentially, kind of their group. But he essentially, kind of in the same way that de Gaulle felt about France, I think that, Peter feels about Russia. He's just like, I don't really care if you don't want to come along with me. I'm dragging everybody out of this, and we're going to kind of take our rightful place. And that includes this thing that he stated, which was the morality of a statesman versus the morality of a private person. And basically just stated that the morality of a private person meant that they had to abide by the law and whatnot. Yeah. Whereas the morality of a statesman, as long as it was in the name of the state's interest, can, murder, commit violence, forgery, deceit, kind of anything they needed to do, as long as it was for the benefit of the people.
This is the holy war dilemma again.
Exactly, yeah.
And a big part of that is what he kind of starts to see being able to talk to these people outside of Russia is the Enlightenment did a lot for the kind of societal structures, because pre-Enlightenment, the church was kind of the main grouping of power, and like
they were like the overarching.
Yes.
Like there were separate powers. You have the Holy Roman Empire, you have France, you have Britain, but then kind of hovering over all of this is this more opaque bubble over the map that says areas controlled by the church.
Yeah. And the Enlightenment era did a whole lot to kind of cede some of that power and individualism away from the church and give it back to the people. And the Russian Orthodoxy, I believe they fell along the same split with the Byzantine split, the schism that happened because they were Greek Orthodox. Russian Orthodox, I'm sure, doesn't get completely well along with Catholicism at this point in time, but they still kind of fall under the same banner. And one of the things that he had done to kind of not necessarily try to push this Enlightenment or Renaissance period onto his people, but he created this group out of the Jolly Company called the All Joking, All Drunken Synod of Fools. And what it was he would give his friends these like bogus religious titles. So it would be like Bishop Big Dick,
Grand Poobah, Cat Dick. They actually named a lot of guys Dick. I remember hearing that several times in the
Dick,
nickname.
Cock, really anything that you can give them. And he would have these ceremonies, quote unquote, where they were just pretty much drinking games.
Yeah.
And as opposed to like what you would do, like if you had a job to do in the church, this would be your job in this synod to kind of play off of it. They would dress them up like the Pope. They would dress them up like friars. Probably not friars, but like priests. And they would just party all night long. Peter was such a legendary partier that he ended up accidentally killing two of his prime ministers via alcohol poisoning because they couldn't keep up drinking with Peter.
And it's not like you can just tap out. It's like you're there.
Yeah.
And if you try to tap out and like, Peter, I got to leave. He's like, sit the fuck down. We're finishing these 8 bottles of vodka.
There's no telling me no at that point. And his outlook on it was that he thought that, he called alcohol poisoning a grave disease, like it's something that you can't control.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, you catch it very quickly, and then it just, I guess, if that's the sense. He had a very, weirdly enough, an unorthodox view as far as the church goes and everything, because once he gets into power and a little bit later down the road, a lot of if you were opening schools and things like that, the church had a huge hand in what was taught. You're not really learning about evolution, all that kind of shit. You're essentially learning theology. He ends up creating this like version of just like secular schools and universities that people can go to, where it's all about the shit that is actually learned during the Enlightenment. But that actually comes a little bit later. Part of his plans for modernization of Russia included, it was basically a complete overhaul. It was going to be modernizing the armies. To do that, he knew they had to become a maritime power. He had heard essentially through not just the grapevine, but probably like court, documents, things like that, just stuff coming in that, of all this power being gained by even a private company, the fucking Dutch East India Company that we had just discussed a little while ago.
Keep in mind, we're talking about the same time frame as the Dutch East India Company right now.
Yeah. So he sees what type of like power, not only from a projection of like military power at sea, but how rich not only a fucking country, but this company that's kind of this country unto itself is becoming. He's like, I got to get in on that. So they need to become a maritime power, but to do that, you need to have access to the sea. You're like, well, Professor Chris, Russia's like has a ton of ocean. All of that now, but at that point, they didn't have access to the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, anything remotely down there, and didn't have access to the Baltic because all of that was under the rulership of Sweden. The only place that they had was way up in the North Sea, and it was someplace that would freeze during the winter, so they couldn't utilize it as essentially like a port.
Not only during the winter, 8 months out of the year it was frozen.
That's what I mean. I meant the winter, but I meant, Russian winter.
Yeah.
8 months.
8 months out of the year, this port was frozen, and we decided it was called Archangelsk.
Yeah. Yep.
It sounds like Archangels, but there's an SK at the end of it because it's Russian, and that's just apparently what they do. But this was really their only port that they could bring things in and out of. And this wasn't them sending exports out. This was ships from other countries coming into Russia to purchase what they had.
How are you also going to be a maritime power if, even if you have all your ships up there, you have to sail them further north, all the way around where Sweden's territory is, all the way past like Scotland and all that shit, all the way down the coast? They needed someplace else. The Black Sea at that point, I think, was under Ottoman control, and then the Caspian Sea was the Safarid. I'm not sure if that was essentially, that had to have been someone down in like the Middle East.
Yeah, it was probably like a sultanate.
I think it actually was.
Okay.
It was the sultanate. He also was like, enough with this whole staying isolated as far as like marrying just in our country or within our groups. All these other countries, we are so far behind. Look at all these other countries that have relationships just based on blood. There's countries that have taken over other countries just simply by someone dying and them being the next in line. We need to we got to get ourselves out there. We got to start fucking other people, and we got to start spreading our fingers. So he starts this, basically a campaign to kind of marry off relatives, things like that, and trying to look for suitors for him.
I think that comes a little bit later on because he has to get, I think that happens after the embassy. Because
this is just what I'm saying, his ideas for the modernization, not simply when he implements them, because there's also his plan of like, we're going to also build this Western European-esque city that's going to be the crown jewel of Russia, and it's going to be the new capital. And we're going to have the best of the best that are trying to build this thing. We're going to pull them in from all over Europe, and it's going to be fantastic because at that point as well, places like Moscow and everything, those weren't exactly built with the intention of like, they were built and then they had to spread out from there. It was never a grid system or a city that was designed for growth. It was just kind of hodgepodge.
They were built by Vikings and Mongols.
Yeah, exactly.
Two people that aren't exactly known for setting down roots.
Their civil engineering roots.
But yeah, as Chris was talking about, this desire to find a better position to create a navy, Peter needed a seaport. In 1695, he would wage a war against the Ottomans for control of the Black Sea at the port of Azov. He was unsuccessful in taking the fortress the first time. He retreated into Russia, and he began to build this small navy, enough to where he could launch 30 ships against these Ottomans in 1696.
And they were in control of the Black Sea.
Yes.
And so he wants control of this because essentially the Black Sea is larger than the Caspian Sea, I believe. And then it allows access to get out through this. Why can't I ever remember this? What's the area? The Bosphorus Straits.
Yes.
And then out into the Mediterranean.
By Constantinople.
By Constantinople and everything. But at the same time, to have control of the Black Sea is going to put you in a position where you can negotiate possibly having access to that by controlling these areas.
Well, maybe it won't freeze over for 8 months out of the year.
So Azov was so important because this actually controlled the mouth of the Don River, where they would actually be bringing in stuff where like Russia could actually bring stuff in here. So having control of that meant that they could kind of get into the Black Sea kind of like unfettered or whatever.
This was his first foray against the Ottomans. This was, his first attempt at trying to gain land.
So this was the Russo-Turkish War, I think, right?
I believe.
Yeah, because they were 1695, like you said. Okay. This is when he tries to take Azov. His plan was simply, hey, we'll just go ahead and approach this thing from the land. We'll cut them off. We'll put the city under siege, and then we'll end up capturing, this fortress this way.
The plan we've been running for the last 300 years.
The plan we've never had to run any differently because we've never had to attack anyone with a water source to go ahead and resupply at their backs. Well, that's exactly what happens is Azov is just able to resupply from the Black Sea and from the river. And so at that point, the thing about a siege is once you put something under siege, you're essentially fighting on one front while waiting for someone to attack you from behind, so it's got to be quick. Because this thing was able to be a protracted siege, it gave the Ottomans time to essentially launch forces, and they had to end up getting out of there. The second campaign, which I think was that spring, 1696, that's when he ends up building the navy. He's like, okay, all I need to do is if I can control it from both directions, this thing's going to go ahead and fall.
And it did. He gained control of Azov. He gained control of this Black Sea port that was so vital and so crucial to his plans.
So a couple of the ships he had. So he had two ships of the line, which are the ones that I think we've discussed it in previous episodes. Whenever you think of like the huge like British sailing vessels that are just like 3 cannon decks, tiered, those are ships of the line in which they would then pull into line and just basically go broadside to broadside with these other, Spanish ships, whatever. So he has 2 of these, 4 fire ships, which are ships meant to be set on fire and crashed into the enemy fleet. Yes. They were simply ships that were sent to be, like, they were probably built very tough so they could try to, like, break into other ships and stick into them and like, catch on fire. But yeah, you just set these ships on fire and then you pointed them, and I'm guessing a dude had to sit there and maybe a small crew, and they were like, sorry guys, you got fire ship duty. Bail off at the very end and we'll try to pick you up from the water at the end of this thing.
Pre-ejection seats.
23 galleys, which are still larger warships, and then a whole bunch of miscellaneous vessels.
And you might ask why the Russians didn't build these before. It was because all of the Dutch immigrants that were there weren't ever utilized. So you have these shipbuilders that are sitting inside of Russia that aren't utilizing their strengths. But since Peter took the time to go talk to these people and get to know them and learn Dutch to be able to communicate, he had people that could build these ships.
I mean, he probably already had him in play because he's going from 1695 in the summer when he fails during the first attempt to the spring of 1696. I mean, it takes a while to build these ships because you're building them by hands. But at the same time, the first time he goes with like 31,000 troops.
He didn't believe that they were necessary, probably.
That's the thing. He's like, these are going to be ready for when I capture this. Yeah. We can send all the ships down here. And it ends up being, he's like, fuck, I have to wait for these things to get done. During this entire like little fight for Azov, the Turks actually show up with 23 ships and 4,000 men and end up having 2 of their ships sunk, I think. And then they're just basically like, no, we don't want this smoke. We're heading out of here.
Yeah. We have other places. We can cede this one place off to him.
Yeah, so they end up, after bombarding the fort from land and sea at this point, Azov surrenders on July 19th. At this point, kind of when and it's not long after, when this place is secured, they're moving all of these other ships here. Essentially, they've established at this point, because they've utilized it, they've established what they consider the Russian Navy, so much so that kind of the recognized birth date for the Russian Navy dates back to October 20th, 1696. That's how far back they trace the Russian Navy, like as far as like recognized when it was created. That's a fucking long time, especially, I know like in America, we're talking 1776, and at that point, maybe we could call it the United States Navy.
Continental Navy.
Yeah, and at that point, though, that's 100 years or a little less than 100 years even before.
They had the jump start. They'd been around for forever.
That's true.
This was just the next step.
At the same time, they're just now getting access to the place where they can put these ships.
Well, and
Our
that's
entire East Coast was
part
nothing
of
but
it.
places to have ships.
Yeah, necessity is the mother of invention, but you can't invent something that you don't have a water source to put them on.
Exactly.
So he makes his first incursion against the Ottomans. He kind of starts to see that maybe these are a foe that he needs to continue to take land from. And also, along with this idea that he has to kind of Europeanize Russia and to change things, he needs to gain support from these Western European allies against the Ottomans. He does something. He gathers what's called the Grand Embassy to travel to Western Europe for
Before we get into this, because this is probably my favorite part of this.
Okay.
We're going to take our bathroom break.
Okay.
Oh my God, Adam. What is that up in the sky? It's a bird.
It's a plane.
It's socials! Oh my God. It's faster than Instagram.
That's historically high pod on Instagram.
More powerful than X?
It's historically high, historically HI on X.
Able to leap tall threads in a single bound.
Back to historically high pod on Threads.
And, I mean, I guess there's still Gmail, right?
We got that too. That is historically high podcast at gmail.com.
All right, guys, back to the show. All right, and now we come to the fucking traveling sideshow that is the Grand Embassy. Part fact-finding mission, part early 1980s rock band tour.
Yeah.
This thing took 18 months and just tore through Europe. This was basically just Peter's excuse to get out, figure out and gather all these different ideas on how to do things, and then bring them back and implement them in Russia.
And again, this is the first trip that a czar is making out of Russia in 100 years. So he's going to go let off a little steam, I feel like. But at the same time, like we talked about, this whole idea is to kind of try to Europeanize Russia. He's out looking for titans of industry, workers that know all of these different skill sets that are mathematically inclined, geometrically inclined, shipbuilders, blacksmiths, just any sort of kind of European revolution that he can then bring back to Russia. And along with that, he also needs support to try to fight off these Ottomans that he's realized have land that he wants.
Yeah, even better. If I can make friends with these people, then they'll actually share the good shit willingly. We can make some diplomatic, trade ties. They can help me out with my Ottoman problem. And at the very least, if I don't make friends with these people, I just find all the people that are actually doing the work, and I just learn how to do this shit from them. So,
and I can get shit-faced the whole way.
Now he goes undercover as Peter Mikhailov. Now, he's avoiding diplomatic events. He is meeting essentially with diplomats, but he's not going to the fancy shit.
No. Well, we also buried the lead with this, and this might be the most impressive thing about Peter out of anything beyond his drinking acumen. Peter, who was trying to go undercover with a fake name, is
of Peter.
Peter, just a different last name, is trying to go undercover as a 6'8" man in 17th century
Europe.
This was still 17th century. I think
the average height was 5'6".
So, if you know that the Russians have a 6'8" king, and you're of any noble ability to know that this guy exists, anybody that walks into the tavern that's 6'8", probably a pretty good guess.
He's Russian.
Yep.
He's got a big group around him doing anything that he wants. He's throwing around a ton of money.
Yeah.
He's 6'8".
Well off.
Who else can this fucking guy be? But, okay, here's the thing. We're going to go through the entourage here and then discuss what they got up to. The entourage included 40 chamberlains. Chamberlains were basically kind of royal officials. They basically ran the house. The way I think about it, the new Batman.
Yes.
Alfred is kind of like the head. It's not just Alfred in Batman where he's the only one that's the butler or Wayne Manor. Alfred also kind of runs the other house support staff and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of what I think chamberlains are. 3 interpreters because he's going to be traveling around to a lot of different countries. 2 clocksmiths because You can't have just one clocksmith. You can have just one cook, though.
Yeah.
One priest. Got to have 6 trumpeters. Got to have guys to announce when you're rolling up.
When you're undercover, that's what you want is trumpeters.
Here's the kicker. 70 soldiers as tall as Peter. Did you see that part?
There's no way that they were as tall as Peter. 6'8" back then. There's no way that you could find that many Russians that were that tall.
You could find. Do you know how many people in Russia? And they didn't have to just be from the army. He could just been like, "Do you guys know any 6'8" people?" Fine, I'll take it down to maybe 6'4", 6'5".
There we go.
He could just go out at any point, and a peasant in Russia, he walks up and he's like, "What are you doing?" "I'm fucking planting turnips." "You want to come with me? I'll teach you how to be a soldier. You'll get to roll around with me. We're going to travel all over Europe." He's like, "Yeah, why?" He's like, "Well, you're fucking tall, and I kind of need to surround myself with tall people."
This would be in the realm of Yao Ming in China.
Yes.
Yao Ming could never go undercover in China. Peter could never go undercover in Europe because he is the Yao Ming of Europe.
Peter could never go undercover in his own home country.
No.
Now, if you're going to have that many tall people, you're going to have to balance it out a little bit with some shorter people. So you're going to bring along 4 dwarves. And you're going to make sure you have a monkey. Because how do you round out any entourage? You got to have a monkey.
Got to have bubbles. I'm just going to get this out in the open now. Little people, dwarves, I don't know what they prefer to be called. I think the common vernacular is dwarves now. And I'm sure that this plays into the fact that I'm a 6'6" gentleman, but I have a fascination with little people that I've had for a very long time. My best friend growing up was 5'1" when I was 6 feet tall. So we were at both ends of the spectrum. I don't know why. I just feel like we have this sort of kinship to where I'm not super duper tall, but I'm taller than the average person. Dwarvens, little people, have the...
You got a Yogi and Boo Boo energy.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Okay.
You need the Boo Boo to your Yogi.
Yeah. So
I'm not that. I mean, I'm 5'8". So I'm not that much shorter, but still, it's a funny juxtaposition, kind of like me and you standing next to each other.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. I love little people. And I had no idea that Russia, through all of the history that we have ever talked about, how many little people have we talked about? Dwarves, sorry, excuse me, whichever one.
Well, there was the show Little People, Big World. I don't know. I would imagine. I don't know.
That was a while ago. Yeah. I don't know. But as far as dwarves go, in all of the history that we've talked about, it's popped up in Lord of the Rings episode, in maybe another episode?
I mean, hobbits are a fictional character, but I get what
still counts. But our little people history is
okay. Well,
rare.
Not to get too grim about it, but mortality rates were already so high that if something, it wasn't the whole point about. Even in Game of Thrones, you hardly see any other people like Tyrion, because the only reason Tyrion was kept alive is because he was born into a wealthy family, and they kind of looked down upon that.
Dinklage?
Yeah. Okay. And then if you have, in your country where it's hard enough to just fucking put food on the table and survive, and you have this kid who is different, and in your assumption of them being different as a baby and stuff like that they're going to grow up and not be able to contribute or just essentially be a drain on your resources, fucking sucks. But they're getting rid of that. Yeah,
and these guys were a part of the entourage, but they were also a part of some of the partying that they did as well.
Yes.
Because apparently... dwarf tossing was the thing back then. So I'm assuming they would pick the dwarf up, they would throw them out, maybe javelin style. You think it's like a heave-ho, or do you think it's like a running toss?
You're going to make me... It's a heave-ho.
Okay. Heave-ho, little people, it kind of makes sense. But, yeah, I didn't know that was a thing. I didn't know that dwarf tossing was a pastime in Russia. But again,
we've seen micro wrestling, and that's
Russian.
Kind of what the modern iteration of that kind of feels like.
Yeah, it blew me away that
but
this
think of seeing that. Think of seeing that rolling into town. You're seeing 70 guys, roughly, even if they're 6'5", they're still taller, a head above everybody else who are walking. You see 4 little people. You see someone carrying a fucking monkey either in a cage, or I would pray that it's riding on somebody's shoulder.
Yeah, gotta be.
And 6 trumpeters announcing him. It's like goddamn Prince Ali coming into Agrabah and Aladdin or it's just like it's a parade, it seems like.
Oh, yeah.
So he's going through Europe with this entourage, with this tour, and the incognito thing really doesn't. I don't think it really gets sold too much. I mean, maybe when he's just traveling through the countryside where no one would know who he was, even if he wasn't this huge guy, that's maybe when he's getting away with it.
Well,
But
I also think, too, less of like that and being noticed and recognized. When he does show up to these big cities, like you said earlier, he wasn't expecting to be invited to any of the kind of pomp and circumstance. Not based on his looks, but based upon he just didn't have the same name as the Tsar, Peter.
Yeah.
Like, this was his way of being like, no, I'm not royal. I know that I look royal. I know that I'm an oddity in this country, but I'm not royal. I'm not him.
so, I mean, he's kind of, during this tour, do you kind of have a breakdown of where he goes first and things like that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but early on, he kind of finds out that this hope of finding support against the Ottomans is not really there because France is fairly friendly with them, and they also have an issue of the succession crisis going on in Spain.
Yeah.
So there's bigger fish to fry than the Ottoman
There's
Empire
stuff
for 'em.
closer to home, especially considering if these people aren't already hostile with the Ottomans, they don't
It's
want to end
behind
up
it.
making. They don't want to end up making another enemy.
Yeah, so eventually at that point, he kind of has to change gears. He kind of starts to look for these craftsmen that we were talking about and to gain these experiences to be able to bring these new traditions back to Russia, to kind of change the culture a little bit and bring in this renaissance that they didn't get to have.
I think he kind of looked at it, he's like, plan A, if I can get in good with the royals, they'll introduce me and point me to the best people that
Yes.
are doing this, and I'll get the information. Plan B is, if I can't get in good with these people, I just have to do a little bit more legwork to find these people, but I'm still going to then, at that point, the plan's going to be the same. So where is the first stop on Petey's world tour?
Latvia. It wasn't Latvia back then. We'll call it Latvia now just because, again, the name is probably pretty insane. He started taking notice of these fortifications in Latvia that were Swedish made because they were occupied by the Swedish at that point. Didn't realize that the Swedish Empire was a thing, but they were pretty good fighters. They had a very large army. They took over large swaths of land.
They basically had Sweden, Norway, all of Scandinavia. It's kind of what it looked like is they controlled. And again, he knows he has this area, Azov, but that's not what he wants. He got that because he could get that. He couldn't take on the Swedish Empire at that point, but were he to have it his way, he wants the Baltic.
Yeah.
He wants that area and have all that access because, again, it's closer to home, and ring-a-ding-ding, it's going to be closer to the new capital of St. Petersburg once he starts construction of it.
Yeah, and Peter is walking around in Latvia and he's looking at these structures. He's looking at these kind of castles that are being built, these guard towers and everything that the Swedish are building. And he's inspecting these fortifications. He's drawing pictures of them. He's measuring things. And there's a Swedish commander that sees him outside of the fortification, measuring things and drawing them up.
Here's the thing, too, and I kind of pointed this out. Sorry to interrupt. He's doing it.
Yes.
When we say he's doing it, we don't mean like the royal we or the royal he.
Mm-hmm.
He is actually doing this. He's learning this stuff firsthand by actually doing it. So then he has the knowledge of all of this stuff. He's still going to try to get people to come back to Russia because it's much faster to have these people doing it, but he wants firsthand knowledge on how this stuff works. So when Adam's saying someone walks out and sees him measuring, that's him down there checking stuff out. You know, his chamberlains are taking notes and everything like that. And he's basically finding this stuff out firsthand.
The Swedish commander that kind of sees what he's doing outside, I don't know if he looked at him at 6'8". I need to know who this guy is.
6'8". We're the closest to Russia. Could it be?
And there's a large group of men out here as one 6'8" guy is measuring our walls. Maybe I need to go check this out. Mm-hmm. He goes out. He tells Peter to stop measuring and to get away from the fortification. Peter then tells him that all he's doing is basically trying to figure out the structure and how it was built. Guy tells him that he needs to stop doing that. Peter's kind of brushes him off. Then the dude points a gun at Peter and backs him away from the fortification, and they end up leaving. Now, this in and of itself doesn't really seem like a big point of contention, but we'll see later on that he doesn't forget about this when it comes to the Swedish.
It's not a big point of contention. He's backed off at gunpoint. He's going to have some fucking feelings about that.
Yeah, at the same time, though, as a Swedish guy, when you see that, would you ever want a potential enemy, like, checking out how your fortifications are built?
No, definitely not. But there had to be a circumstance in which he was there at that location. I think it was more to the fact that I think I read something as well that the Swedish commander didn't acknowledge him essentially as Peter or something like that.
He's undercover.
Like, well, I think at that point, because he was there at a military fortification, there was some...
Potentially, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But regardless, he ends up leaving that area with not a good taste in his mouth and a grudge and an axe to grind.
His next stop will be in Prussia, which I think is kind of more modern day like Germany.
Poland, I think.
Poland? Mm-hmm. Is it? Because Poland's its own thing. I remember
Prussian Empire from like World War I. I'll look it up.
Okay. It would see him, again, as an apprentice for 2 months as an artillery engineer. So he's learning from the Prussian artillery leaders, Russian artillery crew, as to how to run this. And he's not sending these soldiers that he brought with him to do it. He's like, put me in, coach. I need to learn how to do this. I want to see it.
He's still having them train, but he's not sitting back and just being like, you guys learn how to do this. He's down there being like, I want to be able to tell you how to do this and tell you if you're doing it wrong. Plus, this is someone from a young age that showed interest in just like this kind of stuff, the shipbuilding aspect of it, the war. He's looking at this. He's like, we didn't have this shit. We didn't see the development of this stuff. I want to know how every little bit of this, works.
Yeah, to juxtapose what we were talking about, what Chris said earlier with this work hard, play hard mentality, he's an apprentice for 2 months as an artillery engineer.
2 months.
While he's still going out and partying. And this guy is a ruffian in the sense that he would actually like fight his own guards.
Prussia was actually kind of in what was Poland at that time. It was like a part of the section of it that also like bordered the Baltic as well. And it was relatively small.
Okay.
Yeah.
Huh. Like as they would go out, he would pick fights with his guards just to have fun. Like he would walk up and just cold cock one of his guards in the side of the head just to start a fight. He was constantly, while they were drinking, accusing people of being spies and like trying to sabotage his goals and ideas. And while they're overseas, they're out basically starting fights at bars and partying it up like they did at home.
It's goddamn King Ralph.
But at this point in time, like they're in Prussia.
Yeah.
So they're being seen by all these locals partying in these taverns. They're like, what is this? What are these Russian people doing? We've established that they're Russian. Apparently this guy's their king that's hiding out, the big giant guy in the back.
Well, the big giant guy surrounded by all the big giant guys that we can't tell who's who.
And at the
Who's Peter? I am Peter. No, I am Peter.
Everybody's Peter. We're all Peter. But I can't imagine that the PR that they're doing into these places was like, yeah, these Russian dudes aren't savages. They're actually fairly smart individuals. And by all aspects of everything that we learned, Peter's a very smart man. He just...
Still think the guy could be a savage based upon what we're going to discuss here in a few minutes.
Yeah, he's just a ruffian. They would head off to Zaandam, which was a part of the Netherlands, by boat in August 1697 to study the shipbuilding, the sawmills, and the manufacturing.
Okay, so we got artillery, check.
Yes.
Now we're moving on to the shipbuilding, finding out how, because you said it's part of the VOC and the Dutch and everything. Now we're going to find out how to build ships from the guys that have been cranking them out the fastest using their goddamn windmills.
Yeah. they're figuring out how these sawmills are working out. They're learning these shipbuilding techniques from the Dutch, historically fantastic shipbuilders, and then also the manufacturing side of it. So we're not just looking at building one. How can we build 10 at a time? How can we continue to expand this operation to have just large feats? And then after that, how can we use this manufacturing to start building up our country?
Yeah.
He ends up only spending a week there after he has to take off to Amsterdam because he was actually attacked in Zandam. Didn't hear exactly what the attack was, but apparently it was pretty violent and they killed more than a couple people that they had to go ahead and book it. So then they leave off to Amsterdam. He would end up getting special training and experience in a shipyard that was owned by the VOC for 4 months. So the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, the largest company that you would say in the world, he was there working in one of their shipyards, making ships to send out to go raid the Dutch East Indies. Like the crossover here is absolutely incredible that the Russian Tsar was working for a time.
Fucker carrying the mast. This is like 6'8", and that's actually the like Tsar of Russia. It's like, the fuck?
All these dudes, knowingly or unknowingly, are working with the Tsar of Russia and teaching him how to build a ship for the VOC. It blows me away. While he was in Amsterdam, this is where things, as Chris was talking about, we're entering the macabre here. He would attend surgeries at the colleges, like as an excited person.
Yeah, you have like, is this those situations where like the surgical theaters?
Yes.
In the round where everyone would be looking, yeah. That's so fucking crazy that was ever a thing.
I think it's still a thing.
For medical school, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure they were probably, I don't know if there was general admission, but I'm sure that there was maybe more of the public than there should have been in there watching.
Still seems weird for a king to be like, "Hey, can I watch this surgery?"
He would also watch like tooth extractions, different kinds of surgical procedures to kind of get a feel for this.
Weirdly enough, this sounds like a situation where he looks at the advancement in medicine and looks back at Russia and is like, we're behind in fucking everything. Let's see what they're doing. And he's like, yeah, they're doing miracles and surgery. He's like, what do you, like, they're sawing legs off better? He's like, no, like actual, like, dedicated surgery. He's like, I got to see this. I think he goes in there with the intention of trying to see what the advancements and how he can apply that. And what happens is, as he's watching this, he ends up getting erect and he finds out he's got this crazy new kink because who comes marching back after watching a few surgeries with his own little kit?
Yeah. Prior to him getting the kit, though, you remember what he did. He had his entourage that was there watching with him go ahead and bite the cadaver.
Oh, that's right.
That was sitting on the table. For what reason? I'm not sure. But apparently he wanted to get the mouthfeel of a human body somehow.
He's sitting there just looking at it. His couple guys are flanking him, and he's like, looks at one of them, and he's like, wonder what it tastes like. Of course, the guy's like, yeah, totally. And he's like, bite it. He's like, huh? He's like, well, I mean, you wonder what it tastes like too. And I'm obviously, you agreed. I'm obviously not. Here, you bite it too. Points at the other guy, and he's like, the fuck? He's like, yeah, you guys bite it. Just tell me about it.
I can't explain. I don't even think that
he can explain. The King of Russia
it.
tells you to bite a dead body. I guess you bite the fucking dead body.
True, yeah.
Or you become the dead body.
Yeah, and there's also the thread, as you were just talking about, what did he come home with?
Yeah.
He came home with a full surgical kit that he would... Basically, if you were in his entourage and you had mentioned that you had tooth pain or that you had
a hangnail,
something that needed to come off your body, instead of Peter suggesting that you go to the hospital, he just said, "Hey, go ahead and bite down on this, or get a hold of him. I'm going to yank that tooth out myself."
I just see the conversation like, oh God, he's walking around wherever they're staying, just trying to pick up on conversations. Guy's like, my fucking tooth. Or he's like, huh?
What was that? Tooth?
He's like, okay, we can take care of that for you. He's like, no, it's actually not that bad. He's like, you know what? It could get a lot worse. We're going to go ahead and pull this out. He's like, I don't know if that's good. He's like, listen, I've been watching surgeries for over 2 hours. Okay? I know what I'm doing. Have you seen what I can do with a ship? I just studied shipbuilding for 4 months and I can build one of these things. Like, I could definitely take the tooth out of your mouth.
Here's a pint of vodka. You get ready. I'm going to go yank that bitch out. And I wonder if that's what it was. I wonder if everywhere else he got to apprentice and he got to do things. And when it came time to like witnessing these surgeries and these tooth extractions, if he's like,
there's no one else he can operate on.
well, yeah, if he's like, hey, you think I could get in there and maybe rip a tooth or two out? And the guy's like, no, he had one bad tooth and we took it out. You can't just rip good teeth out. He's like, well, but I want to give it a shot. And they're like, no, dude, you're not a doctor. We can't let you do any of this stuff.
You know what? We need to start doing dental exams because the oral health of all of our people here is of top priority. So one by one, I'm going to have you come in. I'm just going to give you a little peek. And chances are everything will be fine. But if not, and just clinks a couple of things together. He's like, we'll take care of it.
Yep. Yeah, how many other people can say that they had their tooth extracted by the Tsar of Russia? I mean,
and I think we're focusing
on
on this mouth thing, but this was also at a point when if something needed to come off, like you were saying, maybe you got some gangrene or something like that on your finger, who was there with a helping hand and a pair of fucking shears?
Peter the Great, ready to go ahead and give you 9 fingers. After his time in Holland, he was invited by William III, the King of England, to come spend time in England. While he was over there, he, for some reason, became enamored with the Royal Mint. There was something about it to the point to where he would end up visiting it 4 times.
We talked about this during the gold rush, and you got fixated about the mint.
Yes. Okay.
Now imagine that you're not just hearing about it. Imagine you're looking at something and it's like, yeah, this is how we make the currency that our entire nation uses, and this is how we keep track of it and keep control of it. And he's just like, oh, we don't do any. This is much better than what we're doing. Like, I need to get in here as often as possible to find out the entire process. Where do you guys get it from? How do you have to stamp it? What weight do you use for it?
Yeah. How are you milling these coins to make them so perfectly uniform? Yeah. I can see that. Interesting little side fact. Do you know who the warden of the mint was in England at that time?
I know you're going to say a name that sounds familiar, but go ahead.
Sir Isaac Newton.
They never met, though.
No. But just the fact that this is going on at the same time.
Yeah.
That old Isaac
and that Sir Isaac Newton was in charge of the fucking mint.
Yeah, also very odd. I'm sure we'll learn more about that when we do him. While they were there for 3 months, and you got to have a place to live. You got to know where you're staying. The King of England goes ahead and has this guy named John Evelyn. We said that was how you pronounce it?
John Evelyn.
John Evelyn. He has this estate that King William goes ahead and is like, stay there. He's not using it right now. You guys can go shack up there and kind of see what's up. Have a little English countryside living.
It's lovely. The landscaping is immaculate. He's got these hedge mazes and everything like that. You guys can get lost in there for hours. You're going to fucking love it.
So putting on again there, we need to impress everybody with Russian manners. They go into John Evelyn's house and absolutely fuck shit up.
The series of events that occurs over the course of the 3-month stay involves destruction of like artwork, furniture. A very charming thing they did was they were wiping their asses with the curtains, which, thinking about that, do you think that they were wiping their asses with the curtains and then just like piling the curtains? Or do you think they were actually going by wiping their asses on the still hanging and being used curtains?
Yeah, I think it's
man, that place probably, like, you got to imagine what that fucking place smelled like.
They hit the chamber pot and then they just walked over to the window, wiped with the curtains, threw the chamber pot outside.
What happens if you're like, how long are you doing that for? Also, if you're walking over to the curtain and you're just searching down the curtain for a spot that doesn't have shit on it.
You're looking for somewhere clean.
Yeah.
Along with the curtains, they were destroying the artwork in the house because they were using them as dartboards. Mm-hmm. Just throwing darts at these paintings.
They just figured out billiards. Yeah. Or not billiards, darts, dude.
True. But just the fact that, like, instead of using a bare wall and just painting something on it or anything like that, I'm sure, I don't know if this is priceless art.
There's some places where you've seen places where there's not even a bare stretch of wall. This could be one of those places that they're like, I guess we could have taken it down, but then what would we have been trying to hit at? It's barely left any holes.
Maybe the best part beyond the shit curtains was the invention of the wheelbarrow had not made it to Russia quite yet. So imagine Peter's surprise when he sees this wheelbarrow outside in this grand, sprawling, beautiful garden estate that they have. Instead of using it in the utilitarian style as one would with a wheelbarrow,
Using the recreational style.
they decided to have drunken wheelbarrow races where one person would get in one wheelbarrow, the other person would get in the other wheelbarrow, and then they would be lifted and they would be carried running through these hedges, running through gardens, just tearing shit up in general.
Just seeing who has the most power to try to push through the bunch of fucking 6'8" guys just shoving each other through these hedgerows and fucking wheelbarrows. So much to the fact that once they actually were, they were kind of enticed to leave. Essentially, they cut some of, because they were also footing the bill for some of this as well.
Yeah.
The monarchy was. So they started to kind of scale back funding for them to kind of give them the hint of like, hey, maybe it's time to start moving along. And then eventually someone ended up kind of like politely kind of kicking them out, right?
Yeah. Apparently the damage was bad enough that John Evelyn wrote William III a letter saying that he needed to pay for all the destruction and damage that the people that he invited to the country had done to his estate.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that King William III did, I mean, this was a very give and take type deal. It wasn't just him over there collecting things and finding all of these different European treasures to bring back to
Shitting
Russia.
on furniture and
King William goes ahead and gifts him a schooner that had a whole crew on it.
that's how they got them to leave.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's like, we got you a boat and it's crewed now. Get the fuck out.
Well, in exchange for this schooner that they received, England received the monopoly for the merchants to trade tobacco in Russia. In all of Russia, England, because they gave him
Russians
this boat.
love to smoke.
Yeah. They got the tobacco contract to sell to Russia just based upon King William letting them shit on the curtains and then giving them a boat.
Where were they getting the tobacco from? They would have been getting it from the colony.
Yeah, it wasn't in England.
The States. It would have been from North America.
They're trading colonial tobacco all the way back over into Russia.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. So yeah, as Chris said, they go ahead and took the schooner onto Poland.
Well, kind of getting back to the business side of things, one thing he also does while he's there in England is he goes in and he observes Parliament. Because at this point, too, he's wanting to enact, again, all these reforms in Russia. They're not just industrial reforms. They're not just agrarian reforms. They're also political reforms because the current structure of how things have been working is too chaotic. He's not going to be able to maintain power. He needs to find a way to where the boyars no longer have the power. The Streltsy no longer have enough power to challenge him. And he's looking at Parliament and these other ideas for government about like, who can I assign to do this? How can I form a council? So again, it's not just about the physical acts of like, how do I build a navy or how do I build artillery? He's like, how do I also run this shit?
Yeah, and still kind of keep his autocracy going on where everything still has to flow through him.
How do I design it to where it also gives my ability to delegate while knowing that my power is more absolute?
Yeah, any ideas that are coming from this are still running through me. I'm the one that greenlights any of these ideas that they have.
But I need to set it up to where I'm getting these ideas.
Yeah.
And I'm not doing everything myself.
Well, and I think we talked about before the episode, there were as many as like 500 people that he brought back just from England alone to Russia.
Yeah.
That came over to work in Russia and to teach these specialty trades. He also got a hell of a lot of people. I want to say it was somewhere in the realm of like 8,000 people that they collected to come back to all of Russia. And
not just about like industrial trades or anything like that. It was people that were coming back from like the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
People that were coming to teach in the schools that he was going to be doing, coming to go ahead and, introduce certain things that they didn't even know about in Russia.
We had different farming techniques, just really anything that he could get a leg up on to bring back to his home country. So now we're on to Poland?
We're on to Poland.
We are on to Poland on the schooner coming from England. I don't know how long that travel is from England to Poland.
Probably not long, considering I think it's 13 miles. I want to say the narrowest point of the English Channel is like 13 miles, but you're still in the English Channel there, I think.
Yeah, but then you got to get all the way to Poland.
Yeah, it's like...
Is that on the coast too?
Yeah. It's just further to, I guess you would consider that the east.
Okay. I haven't looked at the map and checked it out. I should have. On his way to Poland, he is headed there to meet
Poland at this time.
Yeah,
maybe
Poland
not
at
Poland
this
how
time.
you're thinking of it now.
He's going to meet the Queen, and he's going to meet a man named Augustus II, Augustus II, or Augustus the Strong. Now, do you know why this man was nicknamed the Strong?
Was he the fox thrower?
Yes, that was one reason. He was the greatest fox thrower in all of Europe. Now, not only did they throw dwarves, apparently, but they also threw foxes.
I was going to say, does Peter walk up and he lifts up the fox? He's like, this is so light. He's like, I've been training this. He's like, you guys go underhand or you guys go overhand? How do you do this? He's like, because I feel like I can throw this thing a country mile.
Yeah, it's pretty wiggly, but I think I can get this going. And
It's got fur you can hang on to.
Gus is like, no, man, you're not going to challenge me for this. The second reason that he was named Augustus the Strong, he was said to have 400 children.
Oh, that's right.
I don't even know how that's possible, man. That's like that stupid-ass Vince Vaughn movie, but except for instead of being a sperm donor, that's 400 children that he's having
But he's the king.
Yeah, that's got to be a lot of wives and concubines, though.
Also, at this point, was prima nocta maybe still a thing in places because that was allowing the king to like deflower to have sex with the bride before.
Yeah, to bang the brides of everybody else.
Yeah.
Possibly. But either way, I can understand why they would name him the Strong if he had 400 children, because he's got some strong seed at that point. While in Poland, Peter was informed that there was a Streltsy uprising back home. And once he heard that, the wheels started turning. The concern that Sophia had brought the Streltsy back under her power. And maybe not so much that, as the Streltsy saw that Sophia could be the figurehead for them to go back to kind of ruling and controlling things. Mm-hmm. So he orders that the rebellion get squashed, and he orders that they build 14 torture chambers. That feels like a lot of torture chambers.
Well, I mean, no. I mean, like, there were 4,000 rebels.
Yeah, you got to give me more than just no.
Yeah, well, okay. I guess when I'm thinking, okay, so I'm making the confusion here because we're talking about, like, you know, we've talked about Hitler and the final solution of the Holocaust. We've talked about Stalin and all the shit that's happened there. When you just throw me a number that it's 14 torture chambers, I guess to the simple fact that maybe this guy really hasn't built torture chambers before, you think he would start with maybe a smaller number. Yeah. I guess I'm fucking jaded by all of the other torture we've heard about and shit like that. But okay, hold on. Say it again.
14 torture chambers.
14 torture chambers.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the grand scheme of things, him franchising torture chambers is sort of little, but at the same time...
Do you think they were themed?
Possibly.
Maybe that's part of what the torture was and everything. He had them themed as different things.
One of them was like torture chamber sandals.
One of them was a dental office. One of them was a surgical suite. One of them was a forest.
So yeah, as this rebellion squashed, he decides that he has to cut this grand embassy short. A big issue that happened was after Poland, they were supposed to be heading down to Rome so he could meet up with the Pope. There was a belief maybe that because he was a member of the Russian Orthodoxy and they had a falling out with the Catholic Church, that this was potentially a way to try to mend fences, to try to maybe bring that type of religion back in.
Well, think of it from the standpoint of the position of the church at that time, where even in England, like during the monarch episode, we talked about the excommunication. Mm-hmm. That would hurt those countries so much that you're already in a position where the church isn't on super great terms with you. But if you're able to get on the church's good side, you now have access to that entire community that's then under the church. It's a you scratch our back, we'll scratch yours type situation.
Yeah, potentially the church is probably looking to try to bring suitors back in because this is around the time of the Protestant Reformation in England.
Think of the whole reason, Crusades and everything like that, with the fucking church trying to pull the Byzantines back in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could definitely see it. I mean, the Byzantines, I think, are probably a little bit bigger get than the Russian Empire at that point, but regardless, it's still money coming in. So he has to cut out the trip to Rome. He also had to cut out a trip to Venice. I'm sure with his love of boats, going to Venice was probably like what he was looking forward to the most.
He went to Vienna.
In Austria.
He did go to Vienna in Austria.
Yep.
At some point during this trip. Was this after this?
I don't remember.
Because I know that the Grand Embassy ends up ending on August 25th of 1698. I know during a certain point he goes to Vienna. He's not really impressed with Vienna. He wants to go to Venice because he's like super enamored with the canals. He's a boat nerd. He just wants to kind of see how that whole thing works, and he's not able to do that. I think he's pretty pissed when he comes home because they cut his fucking tour short.
Yeah.
He wanted to go see a city built for boats. And so, like you said, 14 torture chambers built. He comes home, kills a bunch of mutineers, does a big display of their bodies and everything as one does to send a message letting them know that, hey, this stuff will not be tolerated in my new Russia.
And where was most of that concentrated around?
That would have been the Streltsy, is that correct?
Well, that was who he was torturing. Where were the bodies primarily hung? Outside of Sophia's window at the convent.
Ah, that's right.
Just to maybe remind her if you were a part of this. Also, to go along with that, some of the nuns that were yeah, that's the right term, right? Nuns?
Yeah.
That were working around Sophia, and some of her chambermaids within the convent were also tortured and questioned as well to try to figure out if she had any connections with this uprising.
This like almost increased like the seclusion that she was put under at the convent at this point. He's still not going to kill her. What he is going to do though, because the Streltsy keep popping up, they haven't been a positive thing in his life previously. Mm-mm. From what, his first experience or one of his first experiences, like, hey, aren't you the motherfuckers that like killed and chopped up my uncle? And they're like, yeah, that's us. So he's like, you guys are fucking done. We're disbanding you. What I'm going to do is instead of having you guys be the only standing military force, I've actually learned some shit while I've been away, and we're going to go and create just a standing army that's going to actually be loyal, that I'm going to be in control of.
Well, and if I need an elite guard, I already have these two groups that kind of help me kick your ass first time. Yeah. So he comes back to kind of a new Russia because it's out with the Streltsy Guard. It's in with all of these new things that they've learned. This embassy trip inspired Peter in so many different ways that it's almost stuff that you don't really think of. But like the official dress and kind of the military dress of how the people within Russia would be. And this is where I get a touch confused, because when you look at traditional English dress, that's made for kind of the climate. When you look at traditional Russian dress, everything is going to be a little bit baggier back then. It was built for the cold of Russia. So to change like the military outfits and uniforms that were probably mostly made of like wool or anything like that were very heavy, something that would keep you warm if it was cold outside, you're kind of pushing that to the side and bringing in this new fashion of a climate that your people aren't used to and will not ever live in.
Yeah, so like European style is coming in. Caftans, which are basically like, the way I look at them is caftans are almost like a robe type thing. Mm-hmm. In the sense that, like you said, it's more free flowing, of course it's decorative and everything like that, but it's more of what you think of like kind of a nomadic, more of like, even like kind of a Middle Eastern type dress, like an Ottoman type dress. And that's where you also kind of, when I saw that, you see a picture of Peter the Great, you're like, that looks like a European picture.
For sure.
He's either wearing an armor, he's wearing a traditional, European military uniform.
Puffy shirt.
Yeah, exactly. But before this was more of like robes and, shit like that. There was also this huge emphasis essentially on kind of like, Stalin kind of sold, was that the virility and like the manliness of the Russian people growing these big, huge beards. Well, the rest of Europe is clean shaven traditionally. Maybe mustache, probably fashionable mustache. Not a tiny one.
No.
Not a little tiny one.
That was a sect that comes later.
Mm-hmm. But he basically is like, you know what? I don't like the beards. We're getting rid of the beards. Everyone, trim your beards. They're like, we really, really want to keep our beards. He's like, you know what? You can keep the beards, but you're going to pay a 100 ruby a year beard tax in order for you to go ahead and keep that. Otherwise, shave the shit off.
And if you're ever in my presence and you're wearing a beard, there's a good chance I'm going to shave it off myself. Peter would literally shave people that would come into his court if he found them to be unkempt. Mm-hmm. And this was a pretty big deal because Ivan the Terrible was somebody that instituted these beards as kind of this, exactly what you're talking about with this clean-shaven virility of man. This beard was almost a religious symbol of like your dedication to how tough you were going to be. Mm-hmm. You were going to be the man that's outside, that's going to make it for himself. And now we're giving that up to the point where they said some people would shave their beards and they would keep it to be buried with them. So when they made it up to heaven, they could be like, I was a supporter for as long as I was able to with this beard.
Please reattach this.
Yeah, can we put this back on? But just stuff like that, to where he's changing so much of it. And again, to me, a beard in Russia only seems like the brilliant idea to have, because you need something to cover your face during this bitter cold that they have to deal with.
One thing he does too is he gets rid of arranged marriages. He's like, we're fucking done with the arranged marriages. That was, and that's still a thing fucking today.
Yeah.
In some places. But his argument on it makes perfect sense. He's like, here's the deal. I'm in an arranged marriage. It's not fucking great. I'm letting you guys know it's barbaric, first of all, that you're making these two people that may not like each other on both sides marry each other. And I believe that it leads to domestic violence. Now, I don't know if he's just speaking from experience, but he's like, I can tell you in 100% of my arranged marriage cases, it has led to domestic violence.
Yeah, it might be from a little bit of experience, but like you were talking about earlier, this is kind of after he gets back from the embassy and he sees how things are going in Europe. If you can avoid these arranged marriages and get out of this idea that you have to do this within your own country, then you can start selling off nieces, nephews, children, to these other kingdoms to try to get a foothold in their politics.
The other thing too is he changes New Year's. He moves New Year's from September 1st that they celebrated in Russia to January 1st.
So September 1st was based upon the years of the creation of the world. Mm-hmm. What are we doing? What is that? How do you figure that out? How do you know what day the world was created? Because obviously the world was created before men were created. So how do you know that date?
How do you also know how that date is still that date based upon the fact that there's been changes in count? Like, it's, again, we're trying to make sense out of the senseless.
Yeah, September 1st is a wild New Year's Day. So yeah, like Chris said, changed it to January 1st, the birth of Christ for the Julian calendar. I'm not sure, again, how that would come to pass, because if you're to believe that Jesus Christ was born on December 25th, how is the New Year starting on the 1st? Of January? Like, what's that thought process? Why wouldn't the 1st of January, or why wouldn't New Year's Day be the day that Jesus was born, December 25th, right? Like,
we're talking about the fictional birthdays of fictional characters.
I know. Another reform was that he would lessen the amount of monasteries in the area. He would kind of start to contract the hold that the church had, and by taking away these monasteries, he's turning monasteries that have kind of these smaller roles with less monks in them, I guess you would say, and just turning them into just regular churches. So he's not stepping on religion enough to try to stomp it out, but he's like, if I can take these guys down a notch and lessen their importance in this empire, they're going to start looking to me as more of the religious figure.
He starts turning some of them into schools too.
Yeah.
So there's this wave of it would be secularism, right? Essentially the separation of like more so. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's this wave of secularism that he's, kind of trying to cover across Russia. He's building canals. He didn't get to Venice, but he fucking loves canals because, again, he thinks that the efficiency Apparently, at this point, too, getting stuff around by boat was probably, they didn't have fucking wheelbarrows.
Yeah.
So, getting stuff around by boat was probably a much better alternative for them. So he's building canals. He's opening educational institutions for all kinds of things, for surgery. He's actually inviting in all of these, foreign specialists to teach at these schools or to kind of help in opening these other schools.
Hey, you have schools of mathematics, schools of navigation that are brought in. They're bringing in specialists from the Netherlands, from Scotland to start teaching these things. And again, we're looking at mathematics and navigation, two skills that are very important for sea travel and also very important in the military.
Which is why he's requiring all of his officers to go to these schools.
He's training a new generation in a new way that they've never had before. We get to 1702. Peter is introduced to a woman named Martha Helena Screw.
Wait. Where are we at?
1702.
Okay, we got to go back for a second.
Okay.
So back in 1700, kind of while he's also on his, on his Rumspringa, whatever it is, Treaty of Constantinople actually gets signed.
Oh, yeah.
I know you love treaties. Okay. So basically it's a 30-year truce between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. The deal is that the Russians get to keep Azov, and the Sultan also allows free Russian pass to the Holy Land as well. So we get a little touch back into the Holy Land as well. So that actually happens. And then also in 1700, this is when it leads to the kind of Peter versus Sweden situation. And he's kind of, because he has this deal with the Ottomans, he's like, okay, I can focus my attention elsewhere. The Baltic has kind of always been my goal. It's much closer. I know I can't take on the Swedes by myself. The whole, embassy tour, that didn't yield the results as far as diplomatic alliances that I was really hoping to. So I got to find a way that I'm able to essentially take on Sweden. And one of the ways that he does this as well is because, again, as he's been bringing these guys back and everything like that, they haven't had a whole ton of time, but he's also been industrializing and opening up. Essentially, the country is just insanely full of these natural raw materials. So all of these advances that he found in how other countries are actually mining for ore, they have these vast forests. So of course they have access to all of this timber for building up the Navy. So he's using this time as well to kind of like also consolidate and modernize his military forces so he can launch this campaign.
This just came across my mind, and I don't know if we have time for a little deviation, but it almost seems like this is a theme in Russian history where they are behind the times so much, and then they get a leader that kind of throws this injection of energy into the country to bring them back up to kind of par with everybody else. Mm-hmm. Because we see this with Peter. We obviously see this with Stalin, is to the detriment of his people. He kind of forced them into this industrial age out of this agrarian lifestyle that they had before.
It's like, if you're looking at it from like the graph, most places would just kind of probably advance it, kind of not a steep angle, but a nice consistent level of advancement. Theirs is flat, 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 spike. And then it has to shoot up to try to catch up with everyone else. Then it's flat, 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 spike.
I do wonder if maybe that's where Stalin gets a little of his influence from. We sure as shit know that Putin right now gained a lot of influence from guys like Peter, from guys like Ivan the Terrible, and from Elizabeth the Great, from her husband. And it only makes me think that potentially we will see another one of these in our lifetime in Russia.
Yeah.
Like, there's a chance that they're going to try to play catch up again. So yeah, his push to get into Denmark, he kind of needs a crew. He needs Augustus the Strong from Poland, and he needs Frederick IV from Denmark. And they kind of come together in this triumvirate to start what's known as the Northern War against Sweden that would begin in 1700. This was a 20-year war. So again, we're talking about another just a war the length that we rarely see before. I mean, I guess the Afghan war was extremely long, but it kind of runs a similar course where eventually it's just not as necessary and they're just kind of over there to try to finish up the job that they can't really get mopped up.
And I mean, just because you're at war doesn't mean you can't be, advancing your personal life. So go ahead with what he ends up meeting.
So we'll jump forward and then we'll jump back again. But 1702, Peter is introduced to Marta Helena Skrowatska. Not important because the name gets changed very quickly here. He was introduced by a friend named Menshikov that was kind of his boy for his entire life. He grew up with him. They were very, very close. At one point in time, he becomes like his most trusted ally. But
was it his mistress to begin with, though?
Yes.
Okay.
So Marta was brought over after her first husband had died in a war against the Russians. She was brought over as basically a slave. I guess the first time that Menshikov laid eyes on her, she was just walking in a line in shackles with just a basic
sack.
Yeah, like a sack over her. He ends up taking her in as basically a, what's the word that starts with a P?
Prostitute?
No, I want to say pilgrim. It's not pilgrim. Like the lowest member of society.
Peasant.
Yeah. Yes, that's the P word. A lot of weed this episode. Brings her in as kind of a peasant servant in the household. He was known to have a few mistresses, and Marta was pretty cute. Caught his eye. One night while Peter's over at Menshikov's house, he runs into Marta. He asks Menshikov kind of
smitten
what her deal is. Menshikov says, she's my servant. She does things around the house. I'm sure he probably mentioned about taking her down a time or two.
Oh, yeah? What does she service?
And Peter decides that he needs a new mistress because his loveless marriage is not going very well. So he would end up taking up with Marta. She would eventually convert to the Roman Orthodoxy. She would become known as Catherine the First. Because back then there was concern that after he was already married and I forgot the first wife's name, but her family would be concerned about him consorting with another woman
in
because
the same way that they ran into between his father's first wife and everything like that. Yeah.
A very similar situation.
Because he had a kid with his first wife that was Alexius, correct? Or Alexei?
Yes.
Okay. So that person, Alexei, he's already got someone in the line of succession with his first wife.
Yeah. So in order to not run into this crisis, they have to keep their relationship on the down low. They were married in secret in 1707. They would be officially married in 1712 after he, instead of divorcing his wife, he talks her into becoming a nun herself and going out.
Which absolves him of his marital requirements.
Yes, and taking up the cloth and taking her vow of celibacy.
He's so charming and so convincing. I wonder how he did it.
And Catherine's a pretty cool chick. She seems like a hell of a lot of fun. She didn't care too much about his escapades with other women. As he would go on campaign and he would be off, they would write letters back and forth to each other.
I feel like it's a real Pretty Woman type situation. She's from the streets. She's smart. She's something new that he, doesn't understand. And they like to experience outside of the relationship. But she knew what was up because what did she tell him?
Just don't bring your VD back home.
Yeah, don't bring that shit back home with you.
They seem to have a pretty great relationship and a great marriage. Later on, after they would become married, when they would travel to go to other places and she would be meeting other royalty, they obviously didn't know anything of her background. They didn't know that she wasn't a noble. Everybody was fairly impressed with the way that she handled herself in public. She was semi-literate, which I think was probably a pretty big deal for women back then. But all in all, she seems like a very supportive woman that I think they had a pretty good relationship. I don't think that this was just a fling of the flesh, as you would say. But she was gentle enough with him to where when he would have like an epileptic fit, she would sit with him. She would kind of nurse him back to health after it. She was very understanding of what his job was and how she could support him. And she was pretty down. There were times, we might talk about a little bit later, where she actually joins him on the battlefield and they're living in tents out there, and she's living the exact same life as these soldiers out there on the battlefield. So she gains a lot of respect of the people because she's out there doing it.
She was a fucking peasant before.
Yeah.
Anything for her, even being at a tent on a battlefield, it's the fucking czar's tent. Anything is better than, she's like, I was just a peasant at this other guy's house and he was forcing me to bang him every so often. Yeah, I have to bang this guy, but this guy actually cares about me and I'm living the best life I've ever dreamed of.
Yeah, I can handle that on the battlefield, I'm sure. So, to get back to this northern war against Sweden, like I said, it began in 1700. It was a 20-year war. It was against someone named Charles the 12th.
Charles the 12th was like the anti-Peter.
He was a nerd.
He was really pious. He didn't drink. Didn't believe in any type of like luxuries or anything. He essentially trained with like his men in like cavalry and things like that. And just from a standpoint, you know, both of them being into military shit, but from a standpoint of just like their social lifestyle, completely polar opposites.
Couldn't be any different. But
if cocaine would have been a thing back then, you know that Peter would have been ripping a rail off of his sword before getting ready to start a battle.
Probably before you get ready to start anything. Mm-hmm. Charles was very, very good at war. He would end up ascending to the throne, I believe it was at 16 years old. And during his lifetime, as far as like growing up, being the heir apparent that's coming through, he was given a lot of the same kind of treatments that Peter was, but his treatments were that of somebody who was being groomed to be the king. So he's talking to military advisors. He's going over different things. He's talking to a history teacher about Alexander the Great at one point in time.
Whereas Peter, when he's in his seclusion, is being actively kept away from military advisors and people to teach him this kind of stuff.
We don't want to get him that psyched up. But Charles is talking to his history instructor about Alexander the Great, and he was talking about his affinity for what Alexander did in the lands that he conquered. And his instructor brings up that Alexander the Great only lived to like 36 or whatever he did. Mm-hmm. And Charles looks at him and he goes, how long do you have to live after you've taken that much land? Like, that was his thought, was quality over quantity when it came to time. If you were that good at what you were doing, it didn't matter how long you lived. Bright. Yeah, there's a reason they're still talking about Alexander the Great at this point in time, is because he was that good. So Charles was very adept at war. He was very good at leading his army. Peter was in search of this warm seaport to expand his navy and to expand his trade.
It's so fucking crazy that they consider even that area in the Baltic to be like a warm seaport just because it didn't freeze up all the time.
Yeah, it's still not great. I mean, it's good in the summertime, but I'm sure in the wintertime it's not awesome. So this idea to move into the Baltic to try to take over is kind of spearheaded by Peter and by Augustus and by Frederick. It didn't last that long that this triumvirate would stay, because Charles XII just basically trounced the Danes in their first meetup. It was bad enough that it forced their full withdrawal, and Charles actually laid siege to Copenhagen, which Frederick didn't think was going to be something that would happen, and immediately is just like, we're out, we'll sign an armistice, I'm done. I've had enough. Yeah, Augustus, Peter, take over.
So, you would think that in this situation, when you're like, they formed like a partnership, this anti-Sweden league or whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. Of course, you're going to team up together and you're all going to attack them in overwhelming force at once. That's what the common thought would be in this situation. Instead, it's like, okay, so when are you going to attack him? Well, we're going to attack him at this point. Okay, great. You fight him. Okay, well, he beat the shit out of us. Oh, that's not good. Oh, he's coming to beat the shit out of us. Okay, yep, we're out. And then all of a sudden, now he's just fighting these three individual forces.
Yeah. Their first was a little bit more of a handicap match. He would focus on the Polish and the Russians, and he would inflict heavy losses on both of these forces, enough to make the Russians retreat back. And for some reason, I don't know why it was, and maybe it was because he beat the Russians so handily the first time that he didn't really consider them a threat anymore.
I think that's what it was, because when he's fighting against the Danes, when he's fighting against so it was the Dutch. Danes are from Denmark. So when he's fighting against them, he's fighting against other more modern European armies.
True, yeah.
Probably a little bit harder in that scenario. Peter, again, still hasn't had the time to implement all of these. Because, again, we're talking about 1700 at this point. He just got back from the Grand Embassy in, the later part of 1698. He has these plans, but he's kind of trying to do these things before he has the ability to actually do them the way he wants to. And so you have this well-supplied, well-trained, advanced, in terms of compared to Russia, Swedish army.
Yeah.
And even if they have a numerical advantage, they're just going to be, their weapons are more advanced. They're going to be causing a lot heavier losses.
Yeah, you don't really even have a chance to see if what you learned is going to work on the battlefield, because it wasn't like they had a warm-up. It wasn't like they brought in a minor league team to try to fight them to see if all of this new military doctrine was going to be effective for them.
And here's the thing, too. Sweden isn't just like, oh, you guys are attacking me, I'll just go ahead and defend my borders. Charles is like, oh, okay, we're fucking doing this? Fine, then we're fucking doing this. Because as soon as he's able to go ahead and take his attention off of Russia when they have to end up retreating, he just gets to go ahead and turn his full focus onto Augustus and Poland. And I don't care how good you are at fox throwing, you're going to get your ass kicked by Charles the 12th because he was built for this shit. And he ends up dethroning Augustus and basically is just like, hey, you know what you should do, Poland? You should put someone that's a little bit more pro-Swedish on the throne. And in 1704, they do just that.
Yeah, he basically cuts the head off of Poland by getting rid of Augustus, because the way that Poland worked back then was, I guess you would say, sort of a republic, because it wasn't a full republic, because it was basically they had their boyar, their version of the boyar over there, which would then get together and they would elect the new king. So there was still an election process, but it was just all of the rich people that had governmental powers would do the voting. And Charles, having just kicked Augustus's ass, probably has the hammer when it comes to choosing where the new king is going to be coming from. So you have a pro-Swedish influence in Poland. The Russians come back strong, though. From everything that we've learned,
21-year war.
Yeah, well, from everything that we've learned about how he got the port in Azov, was he was unsuccessful the first time. He came back, he regrouped, he figured a couple things out. He's figuring out how to use heavy artillery more efficiently. He's figuring out the Navy even better. And when he ends up coming back against the Swedish, the Russians actually score a victory at the fort of Nyen, which gave him access to the Baltic.
Nine.
Maybe. It gives him access to the Baltic, but more importantly, what Chris was talking about earlier, it gives him a spot to where he can lay out the blueprint for what is modern-day St. Petersburg today. By 1704, there was the island that was floating out. This is the weird part about it, was this area of land that they had taken wasn't a good area of land. It was very swampy. There was basically an island to where they started to build St. Petersburg. So it wasn't like a direct connection to land.
And I mean, it makes sense too, because if you're Sweden, you're going to go after, and I don't know if it was strategy on Peter's part or just kind of a lack of awareness on Charles the 12th's part, but that's probably not a super desirable location, which means that the defense of that location might not be as strong. And then also the desire to try to take back the location, especially if it's kind of on the fringe of where you're controlling.
Yeah.
And it's not just smack dab right in the middle of your territory. You might just kind of be like, what are they going to fucking do there? We didn't even really build anything there. We had some, some token place there. But yeah, I guess I let him hold it for a little bit.
Well, and the other part of it too was it was at the mouth of a river, so blockading this place wasn't going to be tough for the Swedes.
Yeah.
They could cut off resources to them. They could stop them from being able to build. which, again, they underestimated the Russian Navy at that point in time. We got to talk a little bit about St. Petersburg now, because this is incredible. Just this city that they built and how they built it. Because, again, the main form of transportation in St. Petersburg was by boat.
Mm-hmm. And that was both by necessity and also by just a personal preference of Peter, because he loves fucking boats. This was also at a time when he was requiring people to travel by boat by sailing. So I don't know. I have never sailed before. I am not one of those people, however, that look at someone who's sailing and saying, I can do that. Because I have no fucking clue what I'm doing, what needs to go up, what rope needs to be this taut, all that kind of shit. I'm guessing that most of the people needing to get around this newly established fortress and city probably don't have a lot of that know-how either. No. And it ends up leading to like the loss of a couple different guys. He ends up losing a couple generals.
Yeah.
Yeah, he ends up losing a couple fucking generals from a boating accident. And so you'd be like, at that point, they're like, oh, Peter, we just lost these guys. They were so important. He's like, oh, we should probably build some bridges. It's like, what do you think, Peter? And he's like, you know what? Let's give them oars. They can start using oars to navigate the waterways and everything like that. I think that'll go ahead and resolve this situation. So not fucking bridges. Let's just give them fucking sticks of wood, and then, all will be solved.
Yeah, that way they can, row their way up and down to figure out which direction they need to go. There's estimates that right around 100,000 people's lives were given to create St. Petersburg. Most of that were Swedish slaves that they had taken from their last win there, and then just a hell of a lot of peasants. Surprisingly enough, somehow the great invention that they had found over in England of the wheelbarrow didn't make its way back into Russia, so all of this digging that they were doing was all by hand, to the point where they were carrying out rocks and loads of dirt just in their arms to try to get them out.
Wheels are for artillery, wood is for ships. We're not wasting it on some. They didn't even know that it would actually carry like gardening stuff, or it could carry stones. They're just like, no, this is a man carrier. We don't need to supply this place with man carriers. They don't need to be having fun.
This is a mode of transportation, not a utility thing. But another thing that he would do that I found pretty funny was, and again, this is awful, but they would ride around to check on like work that was being done in and around St. Petersburg. And if they pulled up and he wasn't happy with the work, he would get out and just beat the foreman. Mm-hmm. He would just knock him around. And the guy that he had put in charge would go on these trips, on these carriages with him. And if there wasn't like a foreman on the job to beat, he would make him get out and he would beat him, and then he would throw him back in the carriage and they would just go on to the next place.
That guy's just sitting there blinking, oh God, let there be a foreman here.
Either that or please let this work be satisfactory. He's already whooped my ass 3 times today. Just let this be okay.
One of 2 options. They've done a good job, or there's a foreman on site.
So he's a pretty hands-on guy, even in his...
across the board.
Yeah, pretty much. From then on, like I said, 1704, this island of Kotlin is where they would begin building their own fortresses for St. Petersburg. The Swedish would then blockade St. Petersburg in 1705. The Swedes fought off the Russians pretty well, just fought off their advance, trying to come into their territory as much, and they continued to make incursions into Russia. The Russians would leave the Polish front in 1706, being pursued by the Swedes, so they were trying to kind of win Poland back for Augustus and keep them off their doorstep. As the Swedes would pursue them deeper and deeper into Russia, we see kind of 2 Russian hallmarks. Peter had this belief of scorched earth. So as they were retreating, they were burning any natural resources that were around that
leave
the
nothing
Swedes
they
could
can
use. And then we also get the onset of the famous General Winter as the
I don't think General Winter's new here. I think General Winter's just something that occurs kind of all the time. Probably at least once a year.
But General Winter, as we know, has taken down many of forces that have moved into Russia.
It has, but who do you think are the people that it shouldn't take down? That should show you
for sure.
how fucking brutal and crazy the Russian winters were. If the fucking Swedes that had that entire area up there in Scandinavia, where it's also snowy and cold as fuck, were like, this is fucking really cold. This is horrible. And part of that has to also be because I believe that area kind of like driving into Russia there, probably a lot of it also being a little bit closer to the sea, blowing that stuff in, those cold fronts, but probably not a lot of trees and everything. So it's plains that these just fucking storms are just moving across.
Well, what are you supposed to do if he went through and went scorched earth and killed off all the natural resources and you have to hunker down for winter? You're waiting on supplies and you're waiting on reinforcements that are showing up.
He's burning the wood. You got nothing to burn for warmth or anything.
They're also trying to figure out how to get these reinforcements to them without being cut off by Russia.
Supply chain issues.
Yeah, it comes up.
They never learn about Russia.
All the time in war. They were pretty sapped of energy by the time it came down to the Battle of Poltava in Ukraine in 1709, and just basically got their asses kicked by the Russians. This was the major death blow to the Swedish. It was a pretty decisive victory for the Russians, and although it didn't end the war, it was kind of the turning point. This was the Stalingrad of
the midway of
Northern War, yeah.
Of the Northern War.
For sure. And after that, there was just kind of some piddly engagements for the next basically like 11 years. 1710, Russian forces would capture Riga, which was actually the town that Peter had the gun pointed at him in.
Ooh.
So, again, we're starting to see...
They call that coming full circle.
Yeah, everything's coming full circle. And this was the most populated city within the Swedish realm at that point in time. So you're taking a major city off the map for Sweden. Tallinn, I believe is how it's pronounced, which the battle that happened in Tallinn kind of cleaned the Swedes out from the entire Baltic provinces. So now instead of just having St. Petersburg, you are able to have a massive front of the Baltic Sea to be able to work off of. Prince Charles had headed off, I believe, into the Ottoman Empire for protection. He was still coming out, taking pot shots, but at the same time...
Charles the 12th?
Yes.
No, King.
Yeah.
You said Prince Charles.
Oh, sorry. Charles the 12th had taken off. He had sought refuge to just basically try to survive. And if your general is in hiding, your military is going to fall apart pretty quickly.
So I think he was sheltered by the Ottoman Sultan, I believe.
Yes.
And then at that point, Peter was like, well, I just got done with this thing with the Swedes and everything. I still have this 30-year truce with the Ottomans. I think he did request they turn over Charles. The Sultan said he's not doing it. But then at a certain point, Charles kind of wore out his welcome. And the Sultan was like, you know what? You're getting to be, I don't think you're going to be able to take this thing back.
Yeah.
I don't think you're going to be able to beat Peter. So you're going to need to maybe kind of find some other place to lay low. And ends up kind of like kicking him out of his protection. Yeah.
And in 1718, Charles would be shot dead while they were laying siege in Norway. So you just lost your king. The Treaty of Nystad would be signed August 30th, 1721, which would officially end this Northern War. Kind of getting back home, this is interesting to me, and I don't know if it comes across the same way to you or the listeners, but we learned about in the monarchy episode, in the Scotland episode, if you had a king that was around a lot, he would tend to usually wear out his welcome. The best thing that a king could do would be to go on to a conquest, to go fight at war.
That's why Richard the Lionheart's so fucking... Yeah. The guy had enough time about to fart in England before he left.
The seats of these crowns were rarely used because these guys were out on campaign doing things.
I think part of that too, especially in this situation, is that he had all of these reforms that he was trying to do. One of them that he did, kind of going back to him observing Parliament, is he ends up like kind of getting rid of the power of the boyars. He establishes, I think, like this council of between 10 or 12 people that kind of like ran the day to day, but couldn't take any actions or make any finalized decisions without him actually doing that. It was also someone that he could go with his ideas and then have that disseminated out and taken care of. He installed essentially like a governor type situation in Russia to where instead of having just the centralized power in one place, he had a reach out everywhere else, and then those guys also reporting to him. So it gave him greater control over essentially his entire empire.
Well, this is massive too, because this reform that he's bringing into Russia, he's a king that's going out and fighting these wars.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Is so he has these reforms, but while he's out doing something, these reforms probably aren't at a full clip. The driving force behind these reforms is out fighting battles and everything. Once he gets back, like you're saying, where they come back and kind of wear out their welcome, once he gets back and his focus is no longer on fighting, but it's on making all of these changes that he's started to lay the groundwork, that's when people that are more of the traditionalists that are going to have a problem with these changes are going to actually start to feel the pinch.
Yeah, more of what I was getting at was they just went through 100 years of their czar never leaving the country. Like, never going out and doing anything.
Oh, so they saw it the other way.
Yeah,
okay,
so
gotcha.
In Russia, they're used to a king being around.
Misread where you're going with
that. Well, your point's very valid too, but they're used to just a very sedentary king that's just kind of there to show up and do things, and
they're partially blind.
Yeah, they're running the day-to-day within the country. Whereas you get this Western European influence where now the king is going out on campaign and he's not there. But like you said, he created this form of government to where he could still have power back at home, just like the English kings and the French kings and everybody that went to the Crusades would have, to where he could come back. And then once he comes back, as you were pointing out, if you're not going to war, you have to start focusing on something else.
Yeah.
And that's when these reforms start kicking in to kind of start to transform the way that things are done. And I think that he did a fairly good job of making all that happen.
He's still making stuff happen even during the war. It's not like he's just taking 21 years hiatus on these plans. Even during the war, 1714, he issues this decree basically for compulsory education for any children of nobility between the ages of 10 and 15. So he's like, these are going to be the people that are going to be helping run this country. I'm going to go ahead and get them educated the way that I want them to be educated. Yeah. So, of course, they're carrying along my ideas and everything. But this is going to be the future generations that are going to be actually seeing these changes be implemented and actually stay long term.
Well, a large part of that was he instituted a law that the firstborn child in each noble family, after this age 10 to 15 in this compulsory education that he laid down, was they had to give the next 20 years of their life in service of the government. So it was preparing them to come in and be good people within the government to know what's going on. In 1719, I had to throw this in just to kind of keep pushing this insane narrative behind Peter. Mary Hamilton was a mistress that he had had prior to. I don't know if they were still hooking up. Don't really know how he found out about it, but she ends up kind of falling on the wrong side of him because he had found out that she was basically having miscarriages, abortions, different things like that. And he accuses her of infanticide. So
regardless if those are bastards, those are still his. And I'm not saying this in defense of that. I'm saying his thought process is, regardless if those are, my bastards, that's still part of my lineage. That's part of my bloodline. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah. And along with whoever else she was hooking up with, she's actively trying to, not actively, but she's basically doing what she feels right to.
And at the same time, what's going to happen when he comes back and she's pregnant with not his, but another one of the people, And I think that was also probably the rationale too, is if she was like, well, I don't even think that these were yours. He's like, what do you mean these weren't mine? Like, who else have you, like that? It's a no-win situation for her.
So she goes ahead and gets a death sentence. She is to be beheaded in the public square. There is a very large audience that's shown up to see this. I'm sure this was a pretty good pastime back then in Russia. No, Peter goes ahead and walks up onto the platform with her. He apologizes to her for doing this, but says that it has to be done, kisses her on the mouth, lays her head down, gets her head chopped off. He then reaches down, grabs it by the hair, picks it up, turns it to where the crowd can go ahead and see the fresh cut wound, and starts pointing out where the windpipe is, where the spinal column is connected to, and just kind of giving a quick little anatomy lesson to these hardened Russians.
This is where you get a peek at the psychopath.
Yeah, that everybody in the crowd is like, shit, we came here to see a beheading. I didn't want to see how the sausage was made. I didn't want to see what happened in there. Once he gets done with his quick little anatomy lesson, he then brings her back to face him, kisses her bloody lips, and throws her head in a basket and just kind of goes off about his day. Like that was just what he showed up to do. He gave a little informative lesson. He kissed a beheaded woman's beheaded head, and then he hauled off and went away to do his thing. He also had this thing called the Cabinet of Curiosities.
They said a lot of rulers had cabinets of curiosities, and it's exactly based on what Adam just said about the beheading. I'm sure you can understand what the Cabinet of Curiosities would actually entail. Not only was it like things from around the world, like trinkets or idols, things like that he found interesting, it was also stuff that you would have to float in formaldehyde, body parts and the such.
Fetuses, fingers, hands, heads, everything that was kept and preserved for this kind of little gross museum that he had. We kind of start to see where he gets his final title, which on November 2nd, 1721, Peter is declared the Emperor of all the Russias. This would include the areas in Ukraine that they had taken and just kind of this new vast expanse of land. He's not only the Emperor of Russia, he's the Emperor of all the Russias.
Just to make sure it's completely clear, along with the new territories, that's encompassing all of what I'm ruling.
Yeah. We did miss it too. I got sidetracked by Mary Hamilton in 1719. But in 1718, he's put pressure on his son Alexei that Chris was talking about earlier. He is the heir to the throne. He will be taking over from him. Alexei is a child born from his first wife. Oh, yeah. Him and Elizabeth also have 12 kids of their own.
You mean Catherine?
Or Catherine, yes.
Yeah.
Him and Catherine have 12 children. Mm-hmm. And she's just rapid firing them out. I think only like 2 or 3 of them live to adulthood. He has 2 daughters.
12 kids like that.
Yeah. He has 2 daughters that'll play a big part coming down later on in another episode. But Alexei is his focus. Alexei is not a child that was born in his father's image. He's very opposite.
Yeah, this is a kid essentially that's butting heads with him. Essentially in every rural ideology, he's more of a traditionalist. He has more, I think, of that because of his family and because he's probably not been around, Peter's court and stuff like that. I don't think Peter was probably really there as an involved father and everything, but Alexei kind of went the other direction, more of the Boyer route, to where he was more of that staunch, traditionalist that was actually fighting against most of the reforms that Peter was trying to do and was very, very vocal about it. Enough so to the fact where he actually had to flee the country because he suspected his father was going to kill him.
Rightly so. He headed off to Austria.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, the emissary that he sends to Austria to go try to bring his son back is a Tolstoy, who is of the lineage of Leo Tolstoy, who wrote the book War and Peace. Mm-hmm. So this is how far back some of this stuff goes.
He's like his great-grandfather or something like that, right?
Yeah, a Tolstoy was involved in this, and he was like the head of the kind of secret police that he had.
Well, and he comes back and he's talking to Alexei, and he's like, "Your father's not mad. He's not mad at you. He knows you've been talking a lot of shit, and basically, letting everybody know that as soon as you're in position of power, you're going to undo all of these changes that he's trying to make. He's not. You know what? He's a little disappointed, but I'm sure it's something that you guys can go ahead and discuss and kind of meet in the middle. So why don't you go ahead and come back with us and we'll get this whole thing squared away. And you guys can get back to, you're going to be on the throne. So you don't want to screw that up. So you know what? What's Alexei going to do? He's going to trust him. He's going to believe him. So
what other choice do you have?
Yeah, exactly. So he ends up coming back, and as soon as they get him to a position where they're able to, they basically just slap him in chains and take him back to Russia.
Yep, he gets locked up in something called the Peter and Paul Fortress. I'm not sure if Mary was a part of this.
God damn it! You beat me fucking to it.
Whole adventure. I don't know if there were any dragons in there. You think there were dragons in the Peter, Paul, and Mary Fortress?
Probably
Nobody named Puff?
There was probably something called the Dragon in this fortress, because this place was basically Alexei's new home that he was going to be tortured at.
Yeah. And some of the torture even came at the hands of Peter. Peter was torturing his own son, trying to get him to fall in line and admit that he was essentially trying to not overthrow, but that once Alexei took the throne, all of the reforms that Peter had just put in to try to catch Russia up, Alexei would basically banish.
And he knows that it's not something to where Alexei, and again, I'm not justifying this, but it's not something that Alexei is just like, oh, when I come in, everyone will just go ahead and go back to the way things were. He's essentially also torturing him to find out who are the people that are actually going to be helping Alexei. Like, there are still these like boyars and everything that are still these, noble families that are still in positions of, higher society. He's obviously going to have support from them.
Yeah.
And those people, if they're rooting against Peter, can also be hindrances to his plans. So they're trying to also get information about kind of who he's working with.
Yeah, absolutely. So Peter has, either by his hands or by him ordering the torture of his son, Alexei ends up dying in prison. What was the rest? He died of illness in prison?
Yeah, so essentially, of course, they're not going to be like, extra, read all about it. Peter tortures son to death. We love our Tsar. No, so this is all happening behind closed doors, but because Alexei is no longer going to be showing up, he's got to essentially put a bookend on that, because he has to let people know Alexei is no longer in business to be the heir. So Alexei actually came down with something. He got really sick. He passed away, unfortunately. And listen, I know that he said some things about me and some, probably kind of left you with a certain feeling about, oh, is there, there's no unity? Is there political intrigue and, conflict and everything? We had a talk while he was sick, and, he said he was wrong about everything. He said that, he came around to my way of thinking, and I know he did some stuff, but we're going to go ahead and just pardon him for all of that. He came back into the fold. So, you know what, this little snafu about my lineage, going against me, that actually is kind of irrelevant. It doesn't matter anymore, because, he came back.
And he's gone now. He got square with God, and then he went to meet God all at the same time. 1722, Peter decrees the abolishment of the transfer of the throne to direct descendants. And this is huge. This is a very big decree to be able to put out there, because this opens up Peter to be able to handpick his heir.
This really hasn't been done before.
No, this is all new. This is something that Russia has never, ever seen
I don't even
before.
mean just in Russia. I mean doing this to be able to essentially pick out of your non-direct descendants. Like, that's extremely new, just even within Europe. There are times when people get overthrown and a new dynasty comes into, but that's not just a rule. That's essentially a violent, overthrow. This is him just saying, so I'm just going to get to fucking pick whoever I think is going to do the best job, or whoever, I want to be in this position, regardless if they're my descendant or not, or direct descendant, I guess.
I'm trying to think, was the example William the Orange and Mary? William and Mary?
I can't remember.
Because I believe familiar. Yeah. I believe William the Orange would end up becoming king. But refer back to the monarchy episode. But it opens it up to anybody that Peter is to choose. His doting wife, his beautiful wife Elizabeth.
Catherine.
I don't know why I keep getting those two confused.
I was just literally waiting for it.
You knew it was coming too. this whole stepping out of the marriage thing was really only a one-way street for Peter. She had gone ahead and made friends, potentially shacked up. I believe that would probably be what was more likely happened with a man that we had talked about earlier named William Mons, that was the brother of Anna Mons, that was the mistress of Peter.
Small world.
Yeah, pretty shocking. So when he finds out that Catherine is a friend, a very close friend, maybe a flesh friend of William Mons, he goes ahead and rounds up William and everybody else around him and goes ahead and tortures them, imprisons them, kills them. And then he just goes ahead and beheads his own friend, William Mons, for banging his wife when he took his sister as a mistress way back before this.
This is a fucking, this is a czar. This is a king. Like, you can't, I get your rationale here.
Yeah.
It's a tit for tat thing. And in the world of blind justice, yes, that's how it should kind of work. But you are literally plowing the fucking czar's wife. There are so many other people that you could, guess what? Even if she comes on to you, you politely excuse yourself and you run for the fucking hills, because that is not going to be a situation you're going to walk out of with your head.
No. And I guess,
I hope it was good. And
I bet it wasn't worth it.
It had to have been good, because guess who doesn't get killed here? Catherine.
No.
In fact, what happens to Catherine?
She gets crowned the Empress of Russia on May 7th, 1724.
And why does she end up getting crowned as the Empress of Russia?
Because Peter has the idea that after he expires, Catherine is going to be the new Empress Zara of Russia. 1723, Peter begins to suffer some bladder and urinary tract issues. I'm pretty sure with as heavy as we've been laying on the VD talk.
It's from the gonorrhea.
Yeah, definitely from the gonorrhea. Peter would end up dying February 8th, 1725 of gangrene in the bladder, which I can't quite think of much that would be worse than gangrene in the bladder, except for one of the ways that they tried to alleviate the urinary tract issues was they installed a catheter in him with zero anesthesia.
Did you see how much it had to drain out?
Oh, what was the number? It was a big number.
I think it was 2 pounds.
Of urine?
Of urine.
That couldn't pass through? Oh my God, that's a lot. But just to think about hooking him up to a catheter, I'm sure he was drunk as could be at that point to do that to him.
Oh, you had to be.
But I don't know how they install catheters now, but I would like to think that
Not
there's
in the way
some
that they installed them back then.
anesthesia involved.
He probably tried to do it himself. He's like, oh, I don't know how to do it.
He's got a set of pliers in his hands. Like, dude, you don't want to use those. That's not the tool for
I'm
this
a
job.
surgeon. I brought surgery to Russia. Let me do this.
Yeah, so Peter ends up expiring February 8th, 1725. And after that, Catherine is crowned the Tsar of Russia. And we see the second woman come to power, leading this new Russian empire that is revamped and ready to go. I mean, Peter was a crazy man that seems to be kind of wildly cunning in his own ways.
Like, how do you get taken down by gonorrhea, though?
I mean, what's the fix for it back then?
Oh, sorry. 4 pounds of blocked urine.
Oh, that's a lot of urine.
As soon as I said 2, I was like, 2's a lot. But 4 is even fucking crazier. Yeah, you get taken down by your dick. I think you could probably trace a lot of rulers in history that in one way, shape, or form probably get taken down by their dick.
Yeah?
I also kind of wonder, too, because, again, this is in 1723. When was it that he ends up, his son ends up dying in 1718?
Mm-hmm.
I know syphilis is one of those things that eats away at your brain.
Yes.
Gonorrhea, I'm not sure. But I would imagine that if you have it for long enough to where it gives you gangrene in your bladder, that might drive you a little bit crazy. Not giving him an out or anything like that, but it just seems like it's so weird. Like we were talking about, it's this weird blend of genius and madness and everything, because he was so interested in like doing this advancement and this modernization of Russia, but he really was kind of a by any means necessary, the rules don't apply to me type person. And I mean, I guess it catches up with you at a certain point.
Yeah, but at the same time, it wasn't like he was directing this stuff. He was so hands-on with being able to learn it. It's like as he broadened his own horizons, it was in effect broadening the Russian horizons.
Yeah.
But he wanted to be the guy to learn it first so he could have kind of an understanding of how everything went. And it's just brilliant madness. Like you say, it was by any means necessary. We're going to drag Russia into this Western European post-Enlightenment, post-Reformation time zone that, I mean, I like him. I like what he did. Bad person, but at the same time, he was just so fun to learn about.
In the grand scheme of things, for historical figures, it's someone like it's both sides.
Yeah.
It kind of always it's people. Like we always want to think that these leaders and these, recognized people in history were these epitomes of morality and shit like that. And they're not. They do, great things, and that's why they're remembered for them. Here's the thing too. A lot of this shit and the bad things about them don't come out till later. And then by that point, all the good that they did, people are like, yeah, but it's the fucking Michael Jackson thing. You're like, he fucking did that to those kids. And then all of a sudden you're like, but Thriller.
It's certainly tough. I think maybe my adoration might be the right term or wrong term. But the reason that I feel the way I do about him is because all of these other kings kind of did their dirty, despicable things behind closed doors. I don't think Peter really cared about that.
No.
Peter didn't have a desire to keep his drunkenness within the walls of the castle. He was just kind of a good time Charlie wherever
Peter was
going
to Peter. And there's a reason he's known as Peter the Great, and he was given that moniker by his people. And that moniker stayed. It's not like it got tacked on like Ivan the Terrible, and that's how people know him and everything. He did really, regardless of doing it rather forcefully, he really did drag Russia out of its dark ages and kind of bring it to its, more modern place in the world. And it's kind of like we talked about before the episode. There's even, fucking Putin even harkens back to comparisons, self-proclaimed comparisons, or those prompted by him to fucking Peter the Great. And so he's definitely one of those people that's, although polarizing, is definitely an iconic figure that people in the way, in a different way than, they look back at Stalin and they're like, we don't like to talk about Stalin. Like Peter is one of those people that they look back on. They're like, this guy's kind of like, you can't touch this guy.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you enjoyed this, we're one end of the Russian Empire, and the research I did into Catherine the Great is going to almost uphold these kind of same, just Russia's a wild place back then, and it again, still is.
And Catherine the Great is not Catherine the First.
No.
So it doesn't go straight from Peter the Great to Catherine the Great. Essentially, there's some time that goes down, and how Catherine ends up coming into power is nuts. But as we leave you at this point, think of it this way. Essentially, the Romanovs, like Adam was saying, their dynasty lasted all the way up to 1918. We're just getting started with it, and all of a sudden after Peter, you now have someone that grew up as a peasant now ruling the Russian Empire. So that's going to make for some crazy shit happening down the line. I'm fucking excited to get into it.
Absolutely.
All right. You got anything else, man?
No, I think we're good.
All right, guys. Well, thanks for joining us on another episode. We'll catch you on the next one.
Peace.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us for another episode. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe and like button. Follow us. If you didn't like what you heard, still hit that anyway, because we'll probably cover something in the future that you do like. Please follow us on our social media. Adam, hit them with it.
Our Instagram is historically high pod, historically high pod, and we are on Twitter at historically high. That's historically HI.
All right. And if you guys want to send in any feedback, suggestions, hit us up on those two, or you can even do it on Gmail. It's historicallyhighpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again.
Peace.